Dusty Creek was a scar on the land, a place that had not been settled so much as it had been abandoned by anyone with better options. It sat baking in the New Mexico territory, sometime around 1875, maybe later, pinned between a flat, shimmering desert that promised heat stroke and a range of red rock mountains that promised ambush. It was a town built on dust and impatience. The only reason for its existence was the stagecoach line that passed through and the railroad line that was clawing its way west, spiked by iron spike. The town was 1 street wide and a mile long with exhaustion. At one end stood Twig's Saloon and the gambling hall, leaking piano music and desperation into the night. At the other, the new railroad depot and the marshal's office, both built of raw, yellow pine that wept sap in the afternoon sun. In the middle, like a single, judgmental eye, sat the First Presbyterian Church, its white paint already peeling to show the gray wood beneath. The air in Dusty Creek was thin and stretched tight, like a gut string on a cheap fiddle. It was a tension woven from the threads of too many different peoples crammed into one water-starved valley. White settlers heading west, cavalrymen in blue wool uniforms looking for trouble, Apache tribes pushed from their lands, bandits who haunted the passes, and the bounty hunters who hunted them. Over it all sat the new kings, the landowners, and the railroad men, who saw the desert not as a home, but as an obstacle to be conquered and mined. In the pre-dawn chill, before the sun had even thought to bleach the sky, the boarding house kitchen was already alive. Lena Cartwright moved through the shadows, her breath pluming in the cold air. She was a woman of perhaps 29 years, give or take a year of hardship. The town considered her plain, and had never been shy about saying so. Her face was too bony, her mouth too wide, her skin a map of freckles that no bonnet could hide. She was not the soft, blushing rose that men wrote poems about. She was a cactus, tough and overlooked. Her hands, plunged into a bowl of flour and lard, were not the hands of a lady. They were red, chapped, and strong, the knuckles swollen from work, the nails cut short. These were the hands of a cook, and Lena was the best cook in Dusty Creek, maybe the only good one. She worked with a silent, practiced rhythm. Biscuits first, rolled and cut with a sharp, rhythmic thud of the tin cutter, then the bacon, thick slabs laid in the heavy iron skillet. The smell of coffee, strong and black, began to fill the small, hot room. This kitchen was her fortress and her prison. She had been engaged once, years ago, to Thomas Reed. He was a handsome man, with blonde hair and an easy smile that had convinced her he was also a good one. He had given her a small tin ring and promised her a life. Then he had seen the daughter of a visiting land agent, a girl of 17 with skin like milk and eyes like blue glass. Thomas had returned Lena's ring with a stammered apology about needing something more, someone younger, someone prettier. Now, Thomas Reed was Deputy Reed, wearing a silver star pinned to a new vest. He was one of Judge Whitlock's men, and Lena, she was still here, her hands in the dough, saving every nickel and dime she could spare. She had a dream, a small, stubborn ember glowing in her chest, her own eatery, a place where the sign was hers, the stove was hers, and no one could ever again tell her she was not good enough to keep. She needed to escape the pitying glances, the casual insults, and the constant, grinding servitude. The sun rose, and the boarding house dining room filled with the clatter of boots and the loud voices of hungry men. Lena moved between the kitchen and the tables, a heavy coffee pot in one hand, a platter of eggs and bacon in the other. Her face was set in a mask of polite, weary neutrality. "More coffee?" "Miss Lena," a young cowboy called out, holding his cup high. He winked at his friends. "A pretty face like yours ought to be smiling more." Lena's smile was a thin, brittle thing she put on like an apron. "We are all out of smiles this morning, Mr. Hanks, only coffee." His friend, a larger man with a tobacco-stained beard, laughed. Leave her be. If she was any prettier, she would have a cowboy husband by now. not be stuck waiting on the likes of us. The table erupted in loud laughter. Lena felt the familiar hot flush creep up her neck, a mixture of shame and fury. She turned away without a word, refilled their cups, and went back to the kitchen. She gripped the edge of the wooden work table, her knuckles white. She would not cry. Instead, she checked the stew for the midday meal, adding a pinch more salt and some herbs she had gathered herself. This was her answer. She would not be pretty, but by God, her food would be perfect. It was the only fight she knew how to win. The dining room was a cross-section of the town's anxieties. Marshall Boone sat at his usual table, a mountain of a man whose loyalty, it was whispered, belonged entirely to the man who paid his saloon tabs. And that man was Judge Whitlock. The judge himself held court at the center table, near the window. Judge Whitlock, who had never practiced law but owned the bank, half the stage line, and the mining rights to the mountains ringing the valley. He was a man in a crisp black suit, his gray hair smoothed back. He spoke in a low, reasonable tone about progress and civilization, about the sacred duty of the white man to tame this land. The railroad is the artery of that progress, he was saying, dabbing his mouth with a linen napkin. Lena served him his eggs, cooked exactly as he liked them, but it is threatened by savages who refuse to accept the guiding hand of Providence. Deputy Thomas Reed sat beside him, nodding eagerly, his new uniform straining across his shoulders. He looked important. He looked, Lena thought with a pang of old bitterness, very pleased with himself. He glanced up as she set down his plate, his eyes flicking over her. It was a look that dismissed her instantly. She was just the help, the woman he had left behind. The gossip of the town drifted from another table, where the marshal's wife and the smithy's wife were having their tea. "Poor thing," one of them whispered, loud enough for Lena to hear as she passed. "Nearly 30, I reckon, and plain as a fence post. She will die as an old maid. Mark my words." Lena kept walking. She had heard it all before. She was too old, too plain, too poor, a rejected woman. The talking stopped. It did not fade. It snapped off, as if a door had been slammed shut on all the noise in the world. The scrape of a chair, the clink of a fork, the murmur of Judge Whitlock, all of it ceased. Lena turned from the kitchen doorway, a fresh pot of coffee in her hand. A man stood in the entrance to the dining room. He was tall, taller than anyone in the room, and built with a lean, hard strength that spoke of deserts and mountains, not towns. He wore buckskins, worn smooth and dark with use, and a long knife sheathed at his hip. A quiver of arrows was slung over one shoulder, alongside a bow. At his other hip, hanging low, were 2 old Colt revolvers in a worn belt. His face was hard copper, framed by straight black hair that fell past his shoulders. A long, thin scar ran from his left temple down across his cheek, pulling at the corner of his eye. He was, Lena thought, half Apache, maybe half Mexican. He was all predator. This was the man they whispered about, the man who lived in the hills, who appeared and disappeared like smoke, the man they said had once led an Apache raid on a wagon train, who had killed an entire cavalry patrol with just his knife and that bow, the man they called Ravenhawk. Some just called him Hawk. He moved into the room, his moccasins making no sound on the wooden floor. The cowboys who had joked about Lena now stared at their plates. Judge Whitlock's smooth voice had faltered. Even Marshall Boone looked uneasy. Trouble, the town always said, followed Hawk. He did not look at anyone. He walked to the smallest, darkest table in the far corner, the one no one ever used, and sat down, his back to the wall. He placed his bow on the floor beside him. For a full minute, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, Mrs. Sloane, the boarding house owner, nudged Lena hard in the ribs. "Well, go on," she hissed. "He is a customer. Ask him what he wants." Lena's heart gave a painful thump against her ribs. She picked up a tin cup and walked toward him. Her hand was trembling, just slightly, spilling a few drops of coffee onto the floor. She felt the eyes of every person in the room on her back. She stopped at his table. He did not look up. He was staring at his own hands, resting on the scarred wood. "Sir," Lena said, her voice barely a whisper. "Coffee." He raised his head. His eyes were dark, almost black, and they looked straight through her. They were cold, yes, but not cruel. As he met her gaze, Lena saw something she did not expect, something that startled her more than the scar or the knife. She saw a profound, bone-deep sadness, an exhaustion that matched her own. He gave a single curt nod. Lena poured the black coffee, her hand steadier now. "Will you be wanting breakfast? We have biscuits and bacon. Stew, later." He looked away from her, toward the window that faced the red mountains. "Just the coffee." His voice was low and rough, like stones rubbing together. His words clipped with an accent she could not place. "Yes, sir." She retreated to the kitchen, her back tingling. She leaned against the wall, taking a deep breath. The room slowly came back to life, but the volume was lower. The laughter gone. The men spoke in murmurs. "That is him," someone whispered. "Hawk, what is he doing in town?" "Heard he scalped that whole patrol up by Skeleton Canyon." "I heard he controls the Apache. Tell them where to strike." Judge Whitlock cleared his throat, regaining his composure. He raised his voice, making an announcement. "As you all see, the threat is not just in the hills. It walks among us. This is why I have petitioned the territorial governor for more troops. The railroad must be protected. Our families, our very civilization, must be protected from these elements." He was looking right at Ravenhawk's back. Hawk did not move, did not give any sign he had heard. He just drank his coffee, his gaze fixed on the world outside the window. Lena watched him. He was the most feared man in town. She was the most overlooked woman. And for a moment, looking at him sitting alone in that corner, surrounded by hate and fear, she felt a strange, unwelcome kinship. He did not belong here, and neither, she felt, did she. She spent the rest of the morning cleaning up the breakfast mess, her mind only half on the rumors she heard. Apache raids on the railroad line. Judge Whitlock demanding action. It all seemed very distant to Lena. She had more immediate concerns. She pulled a small tin box from under a loose floorboard in her tiny room. She counted the coins inside. It was not enough. She was still $2 short on her rent for the week. That was the real war she was fighting. Mrs. Sloane, the owner of the boarding house, cornered Lena by the kitchen stove just as the midday meal was ending. The woman's face, usually set in a look of mild dissatisfaction, was pinched with purpose. "Lena," she said, "not bothering with pleasantries. You are $2 short on your rent, again." Lena felt the heat rise in her face, hotter than the stove. She wiped her hands on her apron, her hands that were already red and chapped from lye soap and scalding water. "Yes, ma'am, I will have it by tomorrow. I was going to bake extra pies tonight to sell at the saloon." "No, Mrs.," Sloane said. The word was flat and final. "You will not. I have a better way for you to earn your keep. The railroad crew out by the Red Bluffs. Their cook is taken ill. They need someone for a few days, maybe 4. They are sending a supply wagon out this afternoon." Lena's heart did a slow, heavy drop. "Out there past the canyon." "Ma'am, I cannot just leave the kitchen here." "I will manage the kitchen." "Mrs.," Sloane snapped, though both of them knew she was a terrible cook and would likely lose them customers. "The point is, Mr. Griggs, the foreman, is paying good money for the cook, and he is paying it to me, Lena, to cover your debt and next week's rent in advance. Judge Whitlock himself wants those supplies delivered without delay, and the men will not work without hot food." It was not a request. It was an order, sealed by her debt. Lena looked down at the floor, at the worn wooden boards she scrubbed every morning. She was being traded, like a sack of flour. "Yes, ma'am," she whispered. Less than an hour later, Lena was sitting on the hard plank seat of a heavy freight wagon. She clutched a small cloth bag that held her only spare apron, a comb, and a small tin of herbs she used for her stews. Beside her, a crate of nervous chickens clucked and rustled. She had never been more than a mile outside of Dusty Creek since she had arrived. The kitchen, for all its insults and exhaustion, was known. This, the vast, shimmering emptiness of the desert, was not. The wagon train was small. Just 2 heavy wagons loaded with barrels of blasting powder, crates of tools, and salted beef, plus the smaller kitchen wagon Lena was riding in. A half-dozen armed guards rode alongside, their rifles held loosely across their saddles. They were led by the foreman, Mr. Griggs, a thick-bodied man with a sour expression who had barely looked at her. They moved slowly, the iron rims of the wheels grinding into the deep red dust. The sun was a physical weight, pressing down, leaching the color from the sky. The red bluffs rose up on either side of the trail, silent walls of stone that seemed to watch them pass. Lena knew the stories. This was Apache land, or it had been, until the railroad decided to draw a line straight through it. The guards were tense. They rode with their hats pulled low and their eyes constantly scanning the high ridges. "This is Hawk's territory," one of the younger guards muttered, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice that sizzled in the dust. "I do not like it." Another guard, an older man with one eye that wandered, grunted. "Hawk ain't the problem. It is the whole damn tribe. Savages, every last one. They ought to clear them all out, send in the army and finish it." "That is what Judge Whitlock says," the young one agreed. "Says you cannot build a nation with rattlesnakes in the nursery." Mr. Griggs, riding near the front, overheard them and looked back. "That is what the army is for. Our job is to get this powder to the railhead before nightfall. Keep your eyes sharp and your mouth shut." Lena listened, her hands twisting together in her lap. The word savages settled poorly in her stomach, like spoiled milk. She had seen them in town, the few Apache who came to trade, quiet and watchful, their faces filled with a pride that the townspeople mistook for arrogance. Her mother, a quiet woman who had died of fever when Lena was 16, had taught her one thing above all, Lena: do not ever judge a person until you have eaten bread at their table and heard their story. These men, with their easy hate, had never shared bread with anyone but themselves. The attack came just after noon, in a narrow part of the canyon where the red walls pressed in so close the sky was just a blue slit above them. A high, yipping cry echoed from the rocks, a sound that made the hair on Lena's arms stand on end. It did not sound quite human. A shot cracked the air, loud and sharp. A bullet whined off the rock face high above them. Then another. "Apache mister!" Griggs roared, pulling his horse around so violently it reared. "Ambush circle the wagons. Get to cover." The men scrambled, their practiced nervousness turning instantly to panic. They dove from their horses, pulling the animals down, fumbling with their rifles. Bullets kicked up dust all around the wagons. Lena saw them then, pouring down a narrow side ravine. A dozen riders, maybe more. They were a nightmare from a dime novel. They were painted, their bodies streaked with red and yellow clay. They wore leather hides and had feathers tied in their hair. They screamed and whooped, firing pistols into the air as much as at the wagons, riding in wide, chaotic circles. Lena did the only thing she could think to do. She tumbled off the high seat backward, into the wagon bed. She scrambled behind 2 50-pound sacks of flour, burrowing into the tight space between them and a crate of iron pots. She pressed her face against the rough canvas, tasting the flour dust, her heart hammering so hard she thought her ribs would break. The noise was terrifying. Gunfire echoed from the canyon walls, multiplying the sound until it felt like 100 men were shooting. The fake attackers yelled in a garbled, broken tongue, shouting words that sounded like a mockery of a language. But as Lena lay there, trembling, a part of her mind, the cook's mind, the part that always observed, began to notice things. The shooting was disorganized. The attackers were riding fast, but they were not closing in. They seemed content to ride in circles and make noise. One of them, who seemed to be the leader, pulled his horse up not 20 yards from Lena's wagon. He was masked by a dirty red bandana. He yelled to his men, his voice slicing through a brief pause in the gunfire. "That is enough noise. Fire a few more at the wagon beds. We just need to leave a sign, make it look good for the army patrol that is coming through tomorrow." Lena went colder than the winter ice on a water barrel. She froze. Her breathing stopped. She dared to peek through a tiny gap between the flour sacks. The leader was yelling at another man, who had ridden too close to the guards. "Get back, you fool," the leader shouted, his voice sharp with frustration. "Do not get yourself shot. Judge Whitlock wants a scare, not a massacre. We just need to drive them back to town." Lena stared, her blood turning to ice water. The man's voice. It was not Apache, it was not Mexican. It was an Eastern accent, clipped and clean, just like the railroad surveyors who stayed at the boarding house. And the man he was yelling at, his leggings were poorly tied, flapping loose, beneath the hide. She saw them clearly. Polished, dark, city boots, the kind a man wore to a bank, not on a raid. She could even smell their tobacco in the hot air. Not the sweet, earthy smell of the local leaf, but the sharp, manufactured scent of expensive cigars. These were white men. They were pretending. This entire attack was a lie. Just as this terrible understanding settled in her, a new sound joined the chaos. It was not the boom of a rifle or the crack of a pistol. It was a sharp, solid thwack that struck the side of her wagon, making the wood jump. It was followed by a wet, sickening thump. One of the fake attackers screamed. A real scream this time, a sound of pure agony. He pitched forward out of his saddle, an arrow buried deep in his shoulder. Another man's rifle flew from his hands, the stock shattering as a bullet struck it, a bullet that seemed to have come from the sky. Lena looked up, past the wagon, to the high ridge on the opposite side of the canyon. Silhouetted against the bright blue sky were 5 riders. They were utterly still, their forms blending with the rock. They were not painted. They were not yelling. They were silent, watching. At their center, on a large black horse that stood like a carving of a horse, sat Ravenhawk. He held a rifle, not a bow, and it was resting steady in his arms, a small curl of smoke drifting from the barrel. The fake attackers froze. Their performance was over, shattered by this new, lethal reality. They were caught, trapped between the wagon guards they were supposed to be scaring and the silent, deadly figures on the ridge above. Hawk and his men opened fire. It was not a wild volley. It was precise, terrifyingly calm. Each shot was aimed. A horse went down, screaming. Another rider clutched his arm, his fake war paint smeared by real blood. A bullet kicked up a plume of dust right at the feet of the leader's horse, making the animal rear in panic. The leader screamed, a different kind of scream now, high and thin with mortal terror. "It is Hawk. It is really him. Run. Forget the plan. Run." The entire band of Apache attackers broke. They scrambled, yanking their horses around, kicking them frantically back up the ravine they had come from, disorganized and terrified. Hawk and his men did not pursue. They just sat on the ridge, watching them go, ensuring they left. It was not a battle. Lena realized. It was a routing. They had not tried to kill them all. They had just stopped them. The silence that fell back into the canyon was heavier and more profound than the gunfire had been. The wagon guards slowly stood up, their faces pale, looking from the dust of the retreating fakes to the silent figures on the ridge. "What in blazes, mister?" Griggs said, his voice shaking. He lowered his rifle. Ravenhawk urged his horse forward, and the animal picked its way down the steep, rocky incline with the sureness of a goat. The other Apache warriors fanned out behind him, moving with the same silent grace. Hawk stopped his horse 10 yards from the wagons. His face was like carved stone, impossible to read, his dark eyes taking in the scene. Lena slowly, unsteadily, climbed out from behind the flour sacks. She was covered in white powder from head to toe. Her dress, her hair, her face, her knees were shaking. But the terror was gone, replaced by a strange, humming awe. Hawk's eyes scanned the panicked guards, the nervous horses, and finally, they landed on Lena. His gaze stopped, held. He nudged his horse closer, stopping right beside the kitchen wagon. He looked down at her, his expression unchanged, but his eyes were intense, missing nothing. "Are you wounded?" he asked. His low, rough voice was the same one from the boarding house, the same accent she could not place. Lena swallowed, the flour turning to paste in her dry mouth. She shook her head. No, sir, I am covered in flour." Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but it was not from fear of him. This was the man they called a monster, a scalper, a killer, and he had just saved them all. He had asked her, the flour-covered cook, if she was hurt. Mr. Griggs, the foreman, finally found his voice, and it was laced with bravado and confusion. He strode over, his rifle still half raised toward Hawk. "What is this? Hawk, you call off your dogs. That was a damn dirty ambush. You set us up." Hawk turned his cold gaze on Griggs. He did not seem insulted. He seemed observant. "Those were not my people." Like hell they were not, Griggs spat, his courage returning now that the danger was gone. "We saw them painted up, yelling their savage cries, Apache, all of them." Lena stepped forward before she could stop herself. Her voice was small, but in the ringing silence, it was perfectly clear. "He is right, Mr. Griggs." Griggs spun on her, his face turning a blotchy purple. "What did you say?" "Woman." "They were not Apache," Lena said, louder this time, though her hands were shaking so badly she clasped them in front of her. "I heard them talk. They were speaking English. Perfect English. The leader, he had an Eastern voice, and I saw his boots, under his costume. They were city boots." Griggs stared at her, his mouth open. Lena pressed on, the words tumbling out. He told his men to stop. He said Judge Whitlock just wanted a scare, not a massacre. He said to leave tracks, to make it look good for the army. There was a dead silence. The other guards looked at Lena, then at Griggs, then at the ground. Griggs's face contorted in a mask of pure fury. And underneath it, Lena saw a flicker of something else. He was afraid. "You shut your mouth!" he roared, taking a step toward her. "You are hysterical. You are addled from the sun and the scare. You do not know what you saw or heard. I will not have a hysterical woman contradicting me. They were Apache. Everyone saw it. That is the report I am making. You understand me." He was silencing her. He was twisting the truth before it even had a chance to breathe. Lena looked at the other guards. They were already nodding, avoiding her gaze. Griggs' story was easier. It was the story they already believed. Hawk watched this entire exchange, his expression dark. He looked back at Lena, and for a fleeting second, she saw that same profound sadness from the morning, but now it was mixed with a bitter, weary understanding. He knew she was telling the truth, and he knew no one would listen. He leaned down slightly from his horse, his voice low, meant only for her. "If you keep riding with them, you will find more trouble." His gaze flicked to Griggs, who was busy shouting orders to reform the wagons. Then back to her. "You're white people. They enjoy blaming my tribe. It makes taking our land much easier." Lena met his eyes. She understood. It was not a threat. It was a warning. It was the truest, most honest thing anyone had said all day. He straightened up, pulling his horse's head around. He did not say goodbye to Mr. Griggs. He did not give the foreman another look. With a silent hand gesture that Lena could not interpret, he and his warriors turned their black horses and rode back up the ridge. They did not seem to hurry, yet they moved with a fluid grace, becoming part of the red rock in the deep shadows. In moments, They were gone. They vanished into the heat shimmer, as if they had been a dream. Lena was left standing in the dust, covered in flour, her heart aching with a truth that nobody, it seemed, wanted to hear. The wagon ride back to Dusty Creek was silent, heavy, and miserable. Lena sat on the hard plank, her dress and hair still stiff with flour, her bones aching from the jolt of the ambush and the fall into the wagon bed. Mr. Griggs and his men rode in a tight, angry bunch, their rifles at the ready. They were the very picture of men who had survived a terrible ordeal. When they clattered into the main street, Griggs was off his horse before the dust settled, shouting, "Marshal, Marshal Boone, we were ambushed, Apache." A dozen of them, maybe more. "Mrs." Sloane came rushing out of the boarding house, her hands clasped to her chest. "Mercy, Lena. Are you harmed?" Lena climbed down slowly, every muscle protesting, "I am fine, ma'am, but Mr. Griggs." "It was a massacre waiting to happen," Griggs bellowed, gesturing wildly as Marshal Boone and Deputy Thomas Reed emerged from the office. "They came down on us in the canyon, painted and howling. We were lucky to drive them off." Lena pushed past him, her patience, which was already worn thin, finally snapping. "That is not what happened," she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the sudden hush. Griggs stopped shouting. He turned to her, his face dark with anger. Marshal Boone and Thomas Reed both looked at her. "Marshal," Lena said, addressing Boone directly, her gaze firm. "Mr. Griggs is mistaken. It was not Apache, it was white man. They were dressed as Indians, but I heard them speak. They spoke perfect English. One of them, the leader, mentioned Judge Whitlock. He said the judge only wanted a scare." The street went utterly silent. Thomas Reed stared at her, his mouth slightly open. Marshal Boone's heavy, impassive face did not change, but his eyes narrowed to tiny slits. "And then," Lena continued, her voice gaining a bit of strength, "Ravenhawk and his men appeared. On the other ridge. They are the ones who saved us. They fired on the white men and drove them away." "Mrs." Sloane gasped. "Lena, what are you saying? You are raving. Hawk is a savage killer." "He saved us," Lena insisted, looking from face to face. She saw no understanding. She saw only disbelief, hardening into suspicion. Thomas Reed was the first to speak. He stepped forward, putting himself between Lena and the marshal. He looked at her with a profound, pitying annoyance, the look he used to give her when she burned the bacon. "Lena," he said, his voice laced with condescension, "you are a cook. You are not a scout. You were terrified. You were hiding behind flour sacks. You told us so yourself. You cannot possibly know what you saw or heard." "I know English when I hear it," Lena said, her hands balling into fists. "I know city boots when I see them." Thomas sighed, turning to Marshal Boone as if to apologize for her. "Marshal, she is hysterical. The sun and the scare addled her. Hawk probably set the entire thing up, made it look like a rescue to throw us off. It is an old Indian trick." Marshal Boone nodded slowly, chewing on a piece of tobacco. He spat a dark stream into the dust. "That sounds about right. Mr. Griggs, your report stands 12 Apache, led by Hawk, deputy. Take the full report. We will send it to the territorial governor. This proves we need those troops." He turned and walked back into his office. He had not looked at Lena once. It was over. Her testimony, the truth she had seen with her own eyes, was dismissed. It was nothing. "Mrs." Sloane grabbed Lena's arm in a tight, painful grip. "You foolish girl," she hissed, pulling her toward the boarding house. "You nearly cost me my standing contradicting Mr. Griggs, talking nonsense about the judge. You get in that kitchen and you do not say another word of this. Do you understand me? Not one word." Lena pulled her arm free at the door, her eyes stinging. "Yes, ma'am." For the next 3 days, Dusty Creek boiled with talk of the ambush, but it was not Lena's story. It was Mr. Griggs's story. Amplified by Judge Whitlock and repeated by Thomas Reed, it became a legend in the space of 72 hours. "Heard they fought for an hour," one man said at the general store. "Griggs and his men held off 20 savages." "And that hawk?" another whispered. "He was there, directing it, bold as brass. They say he scalped one of the attackers who turned tail. That is how vicious he is." "And that poor Miss Cartwright," the smithy's wife said, "fanning herself outside the church, trapped in the middle of it. It is a wonder he did not, well, you know." A miracle from God she was spared. Lena became a symbol, a living testament to the savagery of the Apache and the bravery of the town's men. She was the woman who had been rescued, not by Hawk, but from him, by the timely retreat of the attackers. Her own words had been buried. When she tried, one more time, to explain to a boarder at breakfast, he just patted her hand and said, Now, Miss Lena, you were scared. It is all over. You just focus on these fine biscuits." She was not only dismissed, she was erased. Her humiliation was made complete on the 4th day. She was at the Mercantile, using her meager pie money to buy baking soda, when the door opened and Thomas Reed walked in. He was not alone. On his arm was a young woman, perhaps 18 years old, with pale skin, blonde ringlets, and a dress of blue silk that must have cost more than Lena earned in 6 months. She was precisely the kind of woman men wrote poems about. Thomas saw Lena standing by the counter, and he smiled. It was a wide, proud, cruel smile. He wanted her to see. He strode directly to her. "Miss Cartwright," he said, his voice booming with false heartiness. "Allow me to introduce my fiancée, Miss Annabel Lee." The girl, Annabel, looked at Lena with wide, innocent blue eyes. They held a complete lack of understanding and a faint, unthinking pity for this plain, flour-dusted woman. Thomas took Annabel's delicate, gloved hand and held it up, showing off the new gold ring that glittered on her finger. "We are to be married at the end of the month. Judge Whitlock himself is officiating." Lena felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at the ring, then at Thomas. This was the final rejection, delivered publicly, meant to sting. Thomas leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was still loud enough for the shopkeeper to hear. A man needs something pleasant to look at when he wakes up in the morning. Lena, you understand, something soft and pretty to remind him what he is fighting for. The insult was so sharp, so direct, it took her breath away. It was not just that he had left her, it was that he was rubbing her nose in why. Because she was not pleasant to look at, because she was not soft. Lena gathered the scraps of her dignity. She forced a stiff nod. "Congratulations, Deputy, I wish you joy. Miss Lee." She paid for her baking soda, her coins trembling in her hand, and walked out of the store. Her back was rigid, but she felt as if her spine had been replaced with cracked glass. As she stepped onto the boardwalk, Mrs. Boone and the marshal's wife were passing. They saw her face, saw Thomas and his pretty new fiancée inside the store, and they understood immediately. "Oh, that poor thing, Mrs., Boone said, just loud enough for Lena to hear. "First terrified by Indians, and now this," the other woman replied, her voice dripping with the morbid satisfaction of town gossip. "Well, I always say, the Lord has his reasons for not granting beauty to all. It is meant to build character." Lena clutched the small paper bag. She did not want character. She wanted a place to stand. She realized, in that moment, how truly alone she was. She had been rejected in love, and now she was rejected in truth. The one thing she had, the story of what she had seen, was as worthless as her plain face. No one wanted it. Her dream of opening her own eatery, the little place she had sketched on the back of a recipe, seemed 1,000 miles away. Mrs. Sloane had taken all her earnings from the wagon trip, claiming it was for the trouble Lena had caused, and for the days she had missed. Her debts were deeper, her savings gone. She was trapped. That night, desperation drove her. She was almost out of flour, but she baked. She baked 3 perfect apple pies, using the last of her hidden cinnamon and sugar. The smell filled the cold kitchen. A warm, honest perfume that was the only good thing in her world. She needed rent money, or she would be on the street. She put the pies in her largest basket, covered them with a clean cloth, and walked to the one place she knew men spent money, Twig's saloon. The saloon was thick with blue smoke, the smell of stale whiskey, and the sound of men shouting over a tinny piano. Lena hated it here. She kept her eyes down, moving between the tables, her voice low. "Pie, Mr. Fresh apple pie, 5 cents a slice." A few cowboys, drunk enough to be hungry, bought a slice. A gambler at the poker table bought a whole pie for his table, tossing the coins at her feet. She bent to pick them up, her face burning. And then, through the smoke, she saw him. He was there, in the same dark corner, at the same small table, his back against the wall. Ravenhawk. He was exactly as he had been in the boarding house, as if he had never left. He nursed a single cup of black coffee, watching the room with those dark, unblinking eyes. He was not a part of the saloon. He was a silent, dangerous observer, a wolf watching a dog fight, gauging the weaknesses of everyone present. His gaze swept the room, cataloging the drunks, the gamblers, the loud mouths. For a moment, his eyes met hers across the room. He did not nod. He did not react. His gaze just rested on her for a second, then moved on. She did not dare approach his table. A sudden hush fell over the room as Judge Whitlock tapped a spoon against his whiskey glass. The piano player fumbled to a stop. Judge Whitlock stood up, resting his hands on the bar. He did not have to raise his voice. His presence commanded the room. "Men," he said, his tone grave and paternal, "we are facing a crisis. The savage element, which we have tried so hard to civilize, grows bolder. The railroad, the very lifeblood of our future, is threatened." He paused, letting his words sink in. Then, he turned and pointed, not at Hawk, but directly at Lena, who stood frozen by the poker table. "The threat is no longer just in the hills. It is at our doorstep. These savages ambushed a supply wagon. They threatened one of our own women, Miss Cartwright here," he said. His voice filled with false empathy. "Was fortunate to escape with her life, thanks to the bravery of Mr. Griggs and his men." Every eye in the saloon swiveled to Lena. She was trapped in the spotlight of his lie. He was using her, turning her into a poster for his war. "We must protect our property," Whitlock declared. "We must protect our progress, and by God, we must protect our women from this menace." A roar of agreement went up. Men stamped their feet and slammed their glasses on the tables. "Aye, damn right. Judge, run 'em out." Thomas Reed, who was standing near the judge, flushed with importance. He was part of this great protective force. A man at the bar yelled, "What about Hawk? He was seen out there." Thomas stepped forward, placing his hand on the butt of his new revolver, puffing out his chest. He looked right at Lena, his voice full of brag, playing to the crowd. "I will tell you this, gentlemen. If I had been on that wagon train, I would have put a bullet in every last one of those red savages. That is a promise." The men cheered. The lie was complete, sealed by applause. It was too much. The humiliation at the store, the dismissal by the marshal, and now this theatrical lie built on her fear. It was not them. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the noise like a shard of ice. The cheering died. The saloon went utterly, dangerously silent. Thomas's heroic smile froze on his face. Judge Whitlock's eyes narrowed to slits of cold fury. "What did you say?" Lena Thomas asked, his voice suddenly hard. She lifted her chin. She was trembling from head to toe, but she would not be silent. "I said," she repeated, her voice clearer now. "It was not them. It was not the Apache. It was white man, in paint. I heard them. They were wearing city boots." For a second, no one moved. Then, A single cowboy laughed, a short, barking sound, and the entire saloon erupted. It was not a gentle laugh, it was a roar of ridicule, a hard, cruel, drunken explosion of mockery. "She is crazy. The sun has cooked her brain city boots." "That is a good one," a grizzled miner shouted. "Maybe she is sweet on Hawk wants to protect her man." The laughter doubled. Lena's face went white, then scarlet. Thomas's face was a mask of dark red fury. She had not just contradicted him. She had made him the butt of a joke. "Lena, you are making a fool of yourself," he hissed. "Go home. You are hysterical." "I am not hysterical," Lena said, her voice shaking with a rage that tasted like copper. "I am telling the truth, and you—" She looked him right in the eye. "You were not there." She turned, leaving the last word hanging in the air. The laughter followed her, bouncing off her back. She grabbed her basket. One pie was still unsold. It did not matter. She walked to the door. She had to hold her head high. She would not run. Her path took her directly past Ravenhawk's table. She kept her eyes forward, fixed on the door, refusing to look at him. She could not bear one more pair of eyes looking at her with pity, or scorn, or amusement. But as she passed, she felt his gaze. He did not move. He did not speak. He just sat there, a still point of darkness in the loud, bright room. He simply watched her, and in that brief, silent passage, she felt something that was not laughter and not pity. It was a cold, sharp, profound understanding. He had seen it all. He had seen her tell the truth, and he had seen the town tear her apart for it. She pushed through the swinging doors and out into the black, cold night. She did not go to her room. She went straight to the kitchen. It was dark and cold, her only refuge. She lit a single tallow candle, the small flame a weak defense against the night. She did not cry. Tears were a waste. She put the unsold pie on the cutting board. Then she went to the bin, scooped out the last of her flour into the big wooden dough bowl. She added salt, lard, and a little water. She plunged her hands into the cold, sticky mass. She began to knead. She pushed the dough, folded it, turned it, pushed it again, her movements sharp, angry, and strong. With every push, she saw their faces. Thomas, with his cruel, handsome smile. Judge Whitlock, with his false, fatherly voice. The laughing, drunken faces in the saloon. Mrs. Sloane, calling her a fool. They called her plain. They called her a liar. They called her hysterical. They had stolen her voice. She worked the dough, punishing it, until her shoulders ached and her knuckles burned. The candle flame flickered, casting a long, dancing shadow on the wall. She breathed in the smell of yeast and flour, the only honest thing in her life. She stopped, her chest heaving, and looked down at the smooth, pale, lifeless mound of dough. "I am not pretty," she thought. "The words a cold, hard fact, and they will not believe me." She looked at the black iron stove, her fortress. "But I can cook." This was real. This oven, this flour. This was her truth, and it was her weapon. They could laugh at her face and they could twist her words, but they would eat her bread. They would knead her stew. A cold, hard resolve settled into her bones, as solid as the iron of the stove. If they would not listen to her words, she would fight them with fire and with pans. She would survive them all. The resolve Lena found in the bottom of the dough bowl lasted through the night. A cold, hard ember in her stomach. But I did not pay the rent. Resolve did not change the locked minds of the people in Dusty Creek. The next morning, the boarding house was heavy with a silence that felt different from the usual pre-dawn quiet. It was the silence of a house holding its breath. Mrs. Sloane did not come down to the kitchen. The boarders who came for breakfast ate quickly, their eyes downcast and left without their usual loud talk. Lena was wiping down the heavy dining table when the front door opened, letting in a shaft of bright, accusing sunlight. Judge Whitlock stepped inside, followed by Marshal Boone. The judge removed his hat, his movements smooth and practiced, as if he were entering his own home, which, Lena was about to find out, he was Mrs. Sloane descended the stairs, her face pale and puffy, her dress buttoned incorrectly. She looked not like a proprietor, but like a woman who had been weeping all night. "Judge," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. "Mrs. Sloane," Whitlock replied, his voice full of a terrible, polite sympathy. He held up a slip of paper. "Your marker from Twig's Saloon, the one you signed last night. It came due. I'm afraid I had to, acquire it." Lena stopped wiping. Mrs. Sloane's secret was no longer a secret. Her gambling, which the town had whispered about, had finally caught up with her. "The bank holds the note on this establishment, as you know," Whitlock continued, as if discussing the weather. "And since you have defaulted, I am afraid the bank, which is to say, I must take possession of the property, effective immediately." Mrs. Sloane let out a small, strangled sound. "Judge, please, I can pay. Just give me a week." "A week," Whitlock chuckled, a dry sound with no humor in it. "My dear woman, you do not have a week's worth of credit left in this entire territory. However," he paused, letting her hang on the word, "I am a reasonable man. I will need a manager for the property, someone to oversee it as I transition it into a proper hotel for the railroad executives. You may stay on in that capacity." Relief flooded Mrs. Sloane's face, so desperate and raw it made Lena look away. "But," Whitlock said, and his voice hardened. He turned his head, his cold eyes landing on Lena. "You will clean the house. This establishment needs a better class of clientele, and better help. We cannot have hysterical women who contradict public officers working here. It is bad for business. You will start by getting rid of her." He gestured to Lena with a flick of his fingers, a motion one might use to shoo a stray dog from the porch. Mrs. Sloane, in her desperation to save herself, did not hesitate. Her relief turned instantly to a vicious, panicked spite. She looked at Lena as if she were the source of all her problems. As soon as Whitlock and the marshal had gone, Mrs. Sloane marched into the kitchen, where Lena had already begun packing her few belongings into a cloth bag. "You heard him," Mrs. Sloane spat, her face blotchy. "You have 1 hour. Get your things and get out." "Mrs. Sloane, you owe me 2 weeks' pay," Lena said, her voice quiet, steady. "I owe you nothing," the woman shrieked, snatching a tin of salt from the shelf. "You, with your lies and your stubbornness, you brought this on. You crossed Judge Whitlock. You made this house look bad." "I told the truth," Lena said. "The truth, Mrs." Sloane laughed, a high, ugly sound. "What is your truth worth? You plain old maid, it is worthless. Look at you. You are nothing. I need this room. The judge is bringing in important guests, rich men from the East. I cannot waste space on a cook who cannot even keep a man, let alone her mouth shut." The words were a physical blow. Old maid. It was the second time in as many days she had been rejected, not for her work, but for who she was, for what she was not. She finished tying her bag. It was pathetically small. Her mother's heavy iron skillet, her small tin of herbs, one spare brown dress, her hairbrush, and the small tin box that held her savings, which was now empty. She walked out of the kitchen, the place that had been her prison and her sanctuary for 6 years. She did not look back. She stepped out onto the boardwalk, her bag in one hand, the iron skillet in the other. The morning sun was bright, and the townspeople were out. The smithy's wife, who was haggling over a bolt of cloth, stopped and pointed. Mrs. Boone, emerging from the general store, froze and stared. They all watched. They saw Lena Cartwright, the woman who cooked their meals, the woman they pitied and mocked, get thrown out of the boarding house with her belongings in her hand. They whispered, some with mean satisfaction, some with a mild, useless pity. No one stepped forward. No one offered a word. She was alone, cast out into the middle of the street. She stood there for a long moment, the dust swirling around her ankles, the skillet handle biting into her hand. She had nowhere to go. She could not stay in Dusty Creek. She would not beg. She would not starve. She walked to the livery stable. The stablemaster, a gruff man named Silas, looked at her bag and her skillet with suspicion. "I need to leave town," Lena said. "Stagecoach leaves tomorrow. Costs $5 to Tucson," he said, not looking up from the bridle he was mending. "I do not have $5, Lena said, the admission burning her throat. "What do you have, anything? A mule? A cart? I can pay you when I get to Tucson." Silas laughed. A short, barking sound. "Pay me from where? No, I ain't running a charity." He chewed on his tobacco. Then he pointed with his thumb to the back of the stable. "I got that old buckboard the smithy left. The axle's cracked, one wheel wobbles, and I got that old mule. Jenny, she is half lame and mean as a snake. You can have the pair of them for $3, cash." Lena looked into her purse. She had the pie money from last night. It was $2.30. "That is all I have," she said, pouring the coins onto the counter. Silas looked at the coins, then at her face. He saw her desperation, the hard set of her jaw, the way her eyes refused to weep. He grunted, "Fine, it will get that damn mule out of my feed. But do not come back when she breaks down a mile out of town. The sale is final." 10 minutes later, Lena was trying to back the lame mule into the traces of the wobbly buckboard. The mule resisted, braying and kicking. Lena, her face set, spoke to it in a low, firm voice, the way she spoke to a rising doe that refused to cooperate. Finally, the animal was hitched. She loaded her small bag. She tied the iron skillet to the side, and she put in the last thing she had taken from the kitchen, a large bundle wrapped in a clean dishcloth. It was the cornbread she had baked last night in her fit of resolve. She climbed onto the buckboard seat. The town was still watching her. Deputy Thomas Reed was standing outside the marshal's office, his new fiancée on his arm. He watched Lena cluck at the mule, watched the pathetic, wobbly wheel start to turn. He did not look away. He watched her go, his face impassive. She did not look at him. She looked straight ahead, at the endless, shimmering expanse of red desert that was the only road out. She made it 5 miles. 5 miles, and the town was just a dirty smudge of smoke in the distance. The world was nothing but red rock and blue sky, and a wind that was starting to pick up. It was not a gentle breeze. It was a hot, stinging wind that carried sand, whipping it against her face until her skin felt raw. The lame mule brayed, tossing its head, terrified of the rising noise. The buckboard rattled and groaned, a symphony of decay. Then, with a sound like a gunshot, a sound of dry, ancient wood finally giving up, the wobbly wheel shattered. The buckboard pitched violently to the left. The cracked axle drove itself deep into the sandy trail, and the whole contraption shuddered to a final, permanent stop. Lena was thrown from the seat, landing hard on her hands and knees in the grit. She was stranded. The mule brayed, a high, panicked sound, and tried to bolt, but the broken wagon held it fast. Lena got to her feet, her whole body aching. She looked at the wheel. It was not a wheel anymore. It was a pile of splinters. She looked at the axle, buried in the sand. It was hopeless. The wind howled, a rising, mournful scream. A small sandstorm was beginning to bloom, the air turning thick and red. She was going to die here. All her anger, her resolve, her skill with a skillet. And she was going to die of thirst 5 miles from a town that had thrown her out. She sank to the ground, huddling against the broken wagon, the wind tearing at her hair, pulling the pins loose until it whipped across her face in a frenzy. She did not cry. She was too tired, too empty to cry. She saw her bundle of cornbread, which had been thrown clear. It lay in the sand. She crawled to it, pulled it close, and huddled back against the wheel. shielding the bundle with her own body. It was the only thing she had left. She did not know how long she sat there, listening to the wind trying to bury her alive. A shape emerged from the swirling red dust. Moving so silently, the wind masked its approach. It was a rider on a large black horse. The horse and rider seemed carved from the same dark, patient stone. Ravenhawk pulled his horse to a stop 10 feet away. He sat, utterly still, watching her. He was scouting, as he always was, a ghost on the edges of the white world. And he had seen the wreck. He saw the broken buckboard. He saw the lame mule. And he saw the woman huddled against the wheel, her hair wild, her face streaked with dust, protecting a bundle of food as if it were a newborn child. He dismounted. His moccasins made no sound. He walked over and looked down at the broken axle. He did not touch it. He just looked. It was beyond repair. Lena looked up, her eyes raw and red from the sand. She saw him, a dark, towering figure against the red haze. She was not afraid of him. She was afraid of the desert. He looked down at her. His face was impossible to read, the scar on his cheek standing out pale against his skin. "You will die of thirst before the next town," he said. His voice was rough, like stones, but it was not unkind. "I cannot go back," she whispered, her throat raw. "I cannot stay here." "No," he agreed. He looked up at the sky, gauging the wind. "The storm will get worse. You cannot stay here." He seemed to weigh a decision in his mind. He looked at her, at the pathetic wagon, and at the bundle of cornbread clutched in her arms. "My camp is near," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement. "In the canyons. You will stay there. For a few days, until the storm passes." Lena stared at him. "Your camp," her voice cracked. "In the hills with your people." "It is a camp," he said simply. He unstrapped the leather ties on his saddle. He walked over and, without asking, took her cloth bag and her iron skillet, tying them securely to his own saddle. He looked at the bundle of food in her arms. "Bring that." He went to her mule, which was pulling nervously against the harness. He took his long knife from its sheath and, with 2 quick, efficient motions, cut the animal free from the broken buckboard. He slapped the mule on the rump. "It will follow." He mounted his own horse in one fluid motion. He looked down at her. "Come." He did not offer her a hand. He did not offer her comfort. He offered her survival. Lena stood up, her body aching, and climbed onto the bare back of the mule. She clutched her bundle of cornbread, and she followed him. He led her away from the trail, into a narrow, twisting canyon she had never known existed. The walls rose high on either side, and the wind, though still loud, could not reach them with its full force. The path was hidden, covered in rocks and brush. After 10 minutes, the canyon opened into a small, sheltered basin. It was not what she had expected. It was not a circle of teepees from a storybook. It was a small, permanent settlement, built into the rock itself. There was a low, sturdy structure made of stone and heavy timbers, built against the cliff face, part cabin, part cave. A few smaller hide tents were pitched nearby, smoke rising from their centers. A small, hidden spring trickled from the rock, feeding a trough for a half-dozen tough-looking ponies. 2 young Apache men, their hair long and tied back with leather bands, sat by one of the tents, cleaning their rifles. They looked up as Hawk rode in, their eyes hard and suspicious as they landed on Lena. They looked at Hawk, at his set, impassive face, and they looked away, returning to their work. 3 small children, wearing only breechcloths, were playing in the dust with a skinny dog. They stopped their game and stared, their dark eyes wide with curiosity. An old woman sat on a blanket near a central fire pit. Her face was a beautiful, terrifying map of wrinkles, her white hair braided neatly. She was scraping a deer hide with a sharp stone tool, her movements practiced and economical. She looked up, saw Lena on the mule, and her eyes, sharp and bright as a bird's, moved to Hawk. She grunted, a sound from deep in her chest, an acknowledgement, not a welcome. This was not a den of savage killers. It was a home. It was a poor, hidden, desperate place, but it was a home. Hawk dismounted and tied his horse. He walked over to Lena. "This is my aunt," he said, gesturing to the old woman. "She understands some English. She speaks little." He pointed to the children. "They are children." He untied Lena's bag and skillet and set them on the ground by the main cabin. He went inside and returned with a water skin, which he handed to her. The water was cool and sweet, and it stung her raw throat. She looked around, her cook's eye, always cataloging, assessed their situation. A rack of jerky hung drying in the sun. A few sacks of what looked like beans and cornmeal were stacked by the cabin door. Their food was simple, dry, and built for survival. She took another drink of water, the fog of her despair beginning to lift, replaced by the familiar, driving force of her purpose. This was how she paid her debts. This was how she earned her keep. She looked at Hawk, who was watching her, his expression unreadable. "I cannot pay you for this, sir," she said. He just stared. She gestured at the drying meat, at the sacks of cornmeal. "But I can cook. I have my skillet. Your food. It is good for survival. But I can make it better. I can make a stew. I can make bread that will not break your teeth. I can earn my keep." The old woman, his aunt, paused her scraping. She was listening. Hawk looked from Lena to his aunt. The old woman held his gaze, then gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. "We have beans," Hawk said simply, as if this were a normal transaction, "and dried meat, and cornmeal." "Do you have an iron pot?" Lena asked, her voice stronger. "A big one and a fire." Hawk pointed to a large, blackened cast-iron pot sitting upside down near the fire pit. Lena slid off the mule, her body screaming in protest, but her mind clear for the first time in days. She walked over to the fire. She picked up her own iron skillet, her badge of office. She untied her bag of herbs. She was no longer Lena the old maid, Lena the liar, Lena the outcast. She was Lena the cook, and this was her kitchen. She set to work. She was not in a boarding house, but the principles were the same. She washed the dust from her hands in the spring. She had the young warriors, who watched her with wary curiosity, bring her the beans and the jerky. She put the heavy pot on the fire to heat. She used a little of their lard, then cut up the tough jerky and fried it in the hot fat, the smell of rendering beef and salt filling the small canyon. She added water from the spring, the beans, and then, looking around, she spotted a patch of wild onions growing by the rocks. She gathered a handful, chopped them, and added them to the pot. From her own precious tin, she added a pinch of thyme and dried sage. The smell changed. It was no longer just boiling jerky. It was stew. It was rich, savory, and thick. The three children, who had been watching from a distance, crept closer, their noses twitching. The two young warriors put down their rifles and sat by the fire, pretending not to be interested, but their eyes followed the pot. The old woman put down her scraping tool and simply watched Lena's hands as she moved. Lena took her own skillet. She mixed their cornmeal with water, salt, and a little lard, and she made a stack of thick, sizzling cornbread cakes on the hot iron. When the stew was thick and the meat was tender, she took the wooden bowls the old woman handed her and began to serve. The young warriors took their bowls. Skeptical, they were used to tough, scorched meat. They tasted it. Their eyes widened. One of them looked at the other, then quickly took another bite. The meat was tender. The broth was rich. The children devoured their portions, burning their mouths, not caring. The smallest one, a boy of about 5, held up his empty bowl and said the one word of English he clearly knew: more. The old woman took her bowl last. She held it, inhaling the steam. She took one slow, deliberate spoonful. She chewed, her dark eyes closed. Then she opened them and looked directly at Lena. A slow, gap-toothed smile spread across her ancient face. Hawk had been watching from the shadows of the cabin. He took the last bowl, leaning against the doorframe as he ate. He ate silently, methodically, and he did not stop until the bowl was clean. He offered no praise, but he had scraped up every last drop with a piece of the cornbread. Lena sat on a rock by the fire, her own bowl on her lap. The stew was hot, and the wind howled harmlessly high above the canyon rim. She was covered in dust, her hair was a mess, and her home was gone. But she was safe. She was full, and she was, for the first time in her life, valued. The canyon settled into a deep, profound silence. A quiet so complete it was broken only by the crackle of the dying fire and the high, thin howl of the wind as it passed over the rim. Far above their heads, the children were asleep, wrapped in furs inside the main cabin. The two young warriors, their bellies full, had taken their rifles and disappeared into the shadows to take the first watch. Hawk's aunt had retreated to her own hide tent, leaving Lena and Hawk alone by the embers. The air had turned cold, the kind of biting chill that sinks into the bone as soon as the sun leaves the desert. Lena was scrubbing the heavy stew pot at the edge of the firelight, her hands raw from the sand and lye soap she was using. The pot was clean, but she kept scrubbing, postponing the moment she would have to find a place to sleep in this strange, new world. Hawk sat on the other side of the fire. He had not moved for the better part of an hour. He was tending to his gear, his motions economical and precise. He held his long knife in one hand and a whetstone in the other, drawing the stone along the blade with a soft, rhythmic shing, shing, shing that was both hypnotic and unsettling. The firelight caught the edge of the steel, making it glitter like a sliver of ice. The silence between them was not the awkward, heavy silence of the boarding house dining room. It was a thick, breathing quiet, filled with unasked questions. Finally, Lena set the heavy pot down with a soft thud on the packed earth. She dried her hands on her apron, the one that was still streaked with flour and dust. She sat on a smooth rock, warming her chapped hands by the orange glow of the embers. "She does not like me," Lena said, her voice quiet, nodding toward the tent where the old woman slept. Hawk did not look up from his knife. "Shing, shing, she ate your food," she smiled. "That is more than she gives most." Lena managed a small, tired laugh. It was a dry, brittle sound. "Well, I suppose that is a start. Usually, people eat my food and then tell me what is wrong with my face." He paused his sharpening. He looked at her, his head tilted slightly, his dark eyes watching her in the flickering light. He said nothing, but he was listening. That silence, that focused, non-judgmental listening, unknotted something deep inside her. The things she had held in, the shame and the anger from the last few days, suddenly bubbled to the surface. "I was engaged once, you know," she said, staring into the fire. She had not spoken of this to anyone in years. To a deputy back in Dusty Creek, Thomas Reed. He was very handsome. She picked up a small twig and poked at the embers. He gave me a tin ring. Then he met a girl from the east, all pale skin and yellow curls. He told me he needed something. Softer, prettier. A man needs something pretty to look at, he said. She tossed the twig into the flames, watching it catch and flare. Then today, Mrs. Sloane, the woman I worked for, she lost her boarding house to Judge Whitlock, and the first thing he did to make the place better was to have her throw me out. "Cannot have hysterical women working here," he said, but she called me an old maid, said she could not waste the space on a cook who could not even keep a man. She shook her head, the humor in her voice razor-thin and full of pain. "I have been told I am not pretty enough to be a wife, and I am not quiet enough to be a servant. It seems all I am good for is, this." She tapped her own iron skillet, which sat beside her on the ground. She looked up from the fire and met his gaze directly. His hands were still, the knife resting on his knee. He was just watching her, his face a mask of shadows. A sad, weary smile touched her lips. "I'm not pretty, sir," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the cold night air. "But I can cook." She looked back at the fire, a wave of embarrassment washing over her. She had said too much. "In a place like this," she finished, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Maybe fire and pans are the only things that have ever listened to me." Hawk remained silent for a long time. The only sound was the wind. Far away, Lena felt her face flush, certain she had made a fool of herself, confessing her pathetic life to this dangerous, silent man. He set the whetstone down carefully on the rock beside him. "Pretty," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble. "Fades in the desert. The sun burns it. The wind strips it. It is gone in one season." He looked from the fire to her. His dark eyes seemed to see straight through her, past her freckled skin, past her bony face, to the core of her. "A good cook," he said, his gaze dropping to the stew pot she had just cleaned. "Saves lives." He looked back at her, and the scar on his cheek pulled as the corner of his mouth quivered. Just slightly. It was not a full smile. It was the barest suggestion of one, a flicker of warmth in the cold. But it hit Lena with the force of a physical blow. It was the first time she had seen anything but sadness or cold anger in his eyes. He stood up, a tall, imposing shadow against the glowing canyon wall. "This camp needs a cook, not a pretty one, a real one." He gestured to the cabin. "You stay. You cook. You will be safe here. My aunt will teach you what plants are safe. When I hunt or when I earn money, you get a share. You earn your keep." Lena looked up at him, stunned. It was not charity. It was an offer, a job, a place. It was the very thing she had been denied by everyone else. Yes, she said, her voice thick. "Yes, I will stay. I will cook." "Good," he said. He picked up his knife and sheathed it. The transaction was over. A sudden, fierce gust of wind came down the canyon, a rogue current that made the fire jump and swirl, sending a cloud of ash into the air. Lena shivered, her thin brown dress and worn shawl no match for the sudden drop in temperature. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop her teeth from chattering. Hawk, who had been turning to go, stopped. He looked at her, huddled on the rock, shivering. He watched her for a second. Then, with an impatient sound, he unleashed the heavy blanket roll from his own saddle. It was a thick, worn buffalo hide, the kind that could turn a blizzard. He walked over to her. He did not ask. He simply shook it out and draped it, in one heavy, swift motion, over her shoulders. The hide was heavy, and it smelled of him of smoke, and leather, and horse, and a faint, clean, pine scent she could not place. It was overwhelmingly warm. The heat of it, and the sheer weight, enveloped her. His hand, which was large and calloused, brushed the back of her neck as he settled the hide around her. The touch was accidental, brief as a spark, but it sent a jolt straight down her spine, making her gasp. She froze, her head bowed, clutching the edges of the warm fur. He was standing directly behind her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the freezing air. "You should sit closer to the fire," he said, his voice low, almost at her ear. He moved back to his side of the embers and sat down again, but he had moved his rock closer. Lena, clutching the heavy hide around her, did the same, moving her stone until her knees were almost in the ashes. They sat there in the shared warmth. Their shoulders were only inches apart. The silence returned. But now it was different. It was no longer empty. It was full of the scent of wood smoke and leather, the shared heat of the embers, and the unspoken tension of this new, fragile understanding. Lena watched the orange light play on his strong, calloused hands. He was simply staring into the fire, but she was intensely aware of every breath he took. She felt, in a strange and terrifying way, more seen than she had ever been in her life. The next dawn, Lena was awake before the sky had even begun to pale. The camp was silent, wrapped in the cold, blue light of morning. Hawk was gone, his black horse missing from the small rope corral. The young warriors were asleep in their blankets. Lena did not wait. She knew her role. She pulled the heavy buffalo hide tighter around her shoulders, its warmth a comfort in the chill. She went to the fire pit, uncovered the embers from last night's blaze, and skillfully built them back up with dry twigs and larger pieces of wood. She hung the heavy iron pot and started a pot of beans simmering for the day. She ground a handful of cornmeal and, using her own skillet, began frying batch after batch of cornbread, stacking the pieces on a clean, flat rock by the fire. As she worked, the camp slowly woke up around her. The children tumbled out of the cabin, their eyes wide and their noses sniffing the air. They sat at a respectful distance, watching her. Hawk's aunt emerged from her tent. She stood for a long moment, watching Lena. She saw the new, larger fire, the steaming pot, the growing stack of fresh bread. Lena met the old woman's gaze, her own steady, and then went back to her work. The old woman walked over to the fire. She said something in her own language, a series of low, guttural sounds. Lena did not understand the words, but the tone was one of approval. Then, the old woman reached out a wrinkled, bony hand and rested it, for just a moment, on Lena's shoulder. It was a brief, light touch, as light as a dried leaf, but it was a clear, unambiguous sign of acceptance. Lena felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. Just as the sun crested the high canyon wall, painting the rock in shades of gold and rose, a rider appeared. It was not a hawk. It was one of the young Apache warriors, his horse lathered and breathing hard, as if he had ridden all night. He slid from the pony and spoke rapidly to Hawk's aunt, his voice low and urgent. Lena, who had been offering a piece of cornbread to the smallest child, froze. The old woman's face, which had been placid, hardened into a mask of anger. She snapped a reply, then looked at Lena. "What is it?" Lena asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "What is wrong?" The old woman pointed a long, bony finger back toward the direction of Dusty Creek, a place Lena could not see. "Town," she said. "The word, a curse." The young warrior looked at Lena, his dark eyes filled with suspicion and anger. "He says, town is talking," he said in rough, halting English. "Judge, he tells soldiers a new story." "What story?" Lena asked, her stomach twisting into a cold knot. "He says the woman from the wagon. He says you," the warrior said, stabbing a finger in her direction, "were taken, stolen by Hawk. He says Hawk leads a war party. He says you are his prisoner. He tells the town he must come and rescue you." The blood drained from Lena's face. She understood. She understood the lie with perfect, terrible clarity. Judge Whitlock was twisting the story again. He was not just painting Hawk as an attacker. He was painting himself as a hero. He was using her, the woman he had cast out, as his excuse, his righteous cause to bring the army down on this entire canyon. Hawk's aunt looked at Lena, her eyes sharp. "You brought the snake here," she said, her English slow and heavy. "No," Lena said, her voice shaking. "No, I did not. It is a lie. He is twisting the truth. Hawk knows." She looked at the pot of beans, the sign of her new place. She looked at the children, who were now staring at her with fear. She realized that her silence, her simple act of surviving, had been turned into a weapon against them. If she did not stand up and speak the truth, the one that nobody wanted to hear, these people who had taken her in would be wiped out. The news delivered by the young warrior, Taza, settled over the camp like a layer of ice. The children, sensing the shift in the air, stopped their play and huddled by the cabin door, their dark eyes wide with fear. Hawk's aunt, her face suddenly decades older, spat a curse into the dust and began to scrape the deer hide with a violence that tore the skin. Lena stood by the fire, her hands, still doughy with cornmeal, hanging uselessly at her sides. She was the cause. Her name, the stolen woman, was the excuse they needed. A moment later, Hawk rode into the basin. He did not ride fast, but his black horse was slick with sweat, and Hawk's face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. He had already heard. He swung from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped, his eyes finding Lena. Taza had already told him, his words a low, angry torrent in their own language. "Judge Whitlock is coming," Hawk said, his voice flat, cutting through the tense air. "He is not coming to rescue. He is coming to finish what he started." Lena's heart hammered. "How do you know?" "A message," Hawk said, striding to the cabin to pull his rifle from its saddle scabbard. "From a man in town who does not like the judge. He says Whitlock and Boone have raised a posse. They call it an investigation. They are coming to inquire about the stolen woman." His gaze flicked to her, hard and sharp. "They are coming to wipe this camp out, and they are using your name as the bullet." He turned and spoke rapidly to his aunt. Her sharp reply was a protest. She gestured to the children. He cut her off, his voice firm. He looked at Taza and the other warrior. "Noche. We do not fight here, not where the children sleep." He looked back at Lena. "My aunt will take the children. Go high into the mountains, to the hidden caves. Taza will go with them." "And you," Lena whispered, her hands twisting in her apron. "We will meet them," Hawk said. "Noche and I. We will give them the fight they want, but it will be on our ground. Not this one." His eyes shifted, looking past her toward the mouth of the basin. "We will lead them into the serpent's tooth." Lena had heard the name whispered between the warriors. A narrow, twisting canyon, a natural trap. "They will be led by Marshal Boone," Hawk continued, his voice devoid of emotion as he checked his rifle. "And the man, Reed, your Thomas Reed. He is the one who volunteered to lead the rescue, to be the hero." The name hit Lena like a physical blow. Thomas, of course, coming to save the woman he had thrown away. A perfect, heroic gesture to impress his new fiancée and the town. His aunt was already moving, grabbing dried meat, water skins, bundling the sleeping furs. The children, their faces pale and silent, followed her commands without a word. "What do I do?" Lena asked, feeling useless, rooted to the spot. "You go with my aunt," Hawk commanded, not looking at her. "You are the one they are looking for. You must be hidden." "No," Lena said. The word hung in the cold. Still air. Hawk stopped his movements. He turned his head slowly and looked at her. "No," Lena repeated, and the tremor in her knees was replaced by a strange, cold resolve. "I will not hide. I am the reason they are coming. I will not be the stolen woman, hiding in a cave while you fight a battle in my name. I will not be their excuse." Hawk walked toward her until he was standing directly in front of her. He was so close she could feel the cold radiating from his leather shirt. "This is not a kitchen, Lena," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "This is not stirring a pot. It is gunfire. It is death. You will be killed." "And you will be hurt," Lena shot back, her voice shaking but finding its strength. "Noche will be hurt. If I am in a cave, I am a burden. If I am with you, I can be of use." She gestured, not to her skillet, but to the small bag she had packed when she fled the boarding house. "I have clean clothes. I have my mother's herb tin. I know yarrow. For bleeding, I know how to clean a wound. For 6 years, I have patched up men cut in saloon fights, men gored by steers. I know how to sew skin." She met his gaze, unflinching. "I cannot shoot a rifle. but I will not hide." They stared at each other for a long, silent moment. He was searching her face, looking for the hysteria he had been told she was full of. He found only the same stubborn, practical iron he had seen the night before. His aunt, who had paused her packing to watch, spoke a single sharp word in her own tongue. Hawk gave a short, curt nod. He looked back at Lena. "You will stay at the mouth of the canyon, in the rocks, with the horses. You will not move. You will not make a sound. You will do exactly as I say. This is not a request. It is the only way." "I will be there," Lena said, her heart hammering. "With water and bandages." The serpent's tooth was a scar in the earth, a deep, jagged cut in the red rock. The walls were sheer, hundreds of feet high, and the floor was a narrow, sandy wash barely wide enough for 2 horses. It was a place made for an ambush. By the time the sun had begun to lighten the eastern sky, Hawk Noche and Taza were in position. Taza had refused to stay with the women, insisting his place was with Hawk. The 3 of them were scattered along the canyon rim, invisible among the boulders, shadows against the stone. Lena was hidden far below, tucked into a deep crevice in the rock face near the canyon's entrance. She was surrounded by a fall of boulders that created a small, protected alcove. With her were the horses, 2 extra water skins, and her supplies, which she had laid out on a clean cloth rolls of linen bandages, her small, sharp paring knife, and her precious tin of herbs. The air was cold and still, and the silence was so loud it hurt her ears. She heard them before she saw them. The clink of a horseshoe on stone, the creak of saddle leather, the low, nervous murmur of men. Marshal Boone's posse entered the canyon. Lena peered through a tiny gap between the rocks. She counted 12 men. Boone was in the front, his heavy face grim, his shotgun resting across his saddle. Beside him, looking pale but determined, his new silver star gleaming on his vest, was Deputy Thomas Reed. He was trying to look like a hero, but his eyes darted nervously from one high rim to the other. They rode deeper into the trap, their horses picking their way carefully over the rocky ground. "I do not like this, Marshal," one of the men said, his voice echoing unnaturally off the walls. "This place is a box. It is perfect for a setup." "Shut your mouth," Boone grunted. "The runner said the camp is this way. We are here to investigate, not to fight." "We are here to save Miss Cartwright," Thomas said, his voice a little too loud, a little too high. "And to bring that savage Hawk to justice." Hawk let them come. He waited until they were in the deepest, narrowest part of the wash, a place where the walls were so close they could almost touch them on either side. A single rifle shot cracked the morning. It did not come from the rim. It came from behind them, near the mouth of the canyon. One of the rearmost men screamed and pitched forward, shot from his horse. "Ambush!" Boone roared, yanking his horse around. "They are behind us! Retreat, retreat!" But as the posse turned in panic, new gunfire erupted, this time from the rims in front of them. Crack, crack, crack. Bullets rained down, whining off the canyon walls, kicking up sprays of rock and sand. A horse screamed and fell, blocking the narrow path of retreat. The posse was trapped. "Take cover!" Thomas yelled, leaping from his horse and pressing himself against the canyon wall, his rifle firing uselessly at the unseen enemy above. "Fire at the cliffs! Fire!" The canyon exploded into a deafening roar of gunfire. The posse, caught on the open ground, scrambled for any cover they could find, crouching behind dead horses and small rocks. They were firing wildly, wasting ammunition on shadows. From above, Hawk and his men answered. Their fire was not wild. It was slow, precise, and deadly. Each shot was aimed. Another man cried out, clutching his leg. Another dropped his rifle, his hand a sudden, bloody mess. Hawk's men were not trying to massacre them. They were dismantling them. They moved like ghosts along the rim, firing from one spot, then vanishing, only to reappear 20 yards away. The posse was being taken apart by an enemy they could not even see. Lena huddled in her alcove, her hands over her ears, her body shaking so hard her teeth chattered. The smell of gun smoke was thick and acrid, burning her lungs. It felt as if the world was ending. A shape suddenly fell into her alcove, scrambling over the rocks and collapsing onto the sandy floor. Lena screamed. It was Taza, the young warrior. His face was pale, his teeth gritted in agony. His leather shirt, on his left side, was soaked with a dark, spreading stain. "Taza!" Lena gasped, her fear instantly vanishing, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. "On the rim!" he gasped, his English thick with pain. "A bullet, from below. It hit the rock, the stone, hit me." She ripped his shirt open. It was not a clean bullet hole. His side was a raw, bloody mass of torn flesh, and a long, wicked splinter of red rock was embedded deep in his ribs. It was bleeding, and bleeding badly. "This is my kitchen," she whispered to herself. This was her work. "Hold still," she commanded, her voice firm, the voice she used with frightened horses and crying children. She grabbed a clean linen bandage and pressed it hard against the wound, beside the splinter. Taza grunted, his body tensing. "Hold this," she ordered, placing his own hand on the cloth. "Press hard." She looked at the stone splinter. It had to come out, or the wound would turn foul. She grabbed her small paring knife, the one she used to cut vegetables, and held the tip of it in the small, smokeless fire she had been ordered to keep for smoke signals. She held it there until the steel glowed orange. Taza's eyes, wide with pain, watched her. "This will hurt," she said softly. "I am sorry. Do not move." She took a steadying breath. With a surgeon's precision, she used the hot point of the knife to probe the wound, to get leverage under the stone. Taza let out a long, hissing breath, his whole body going rigid, but he did not cry out. With a quick, sharp twist of her wrist, she pried the bloody splinter free. She threw the stone and the knife aside and immediately packed the wound with a thick handful of yarrow from her tin. Then, using her strongest, cleanest bandages, she bound his ribs, pulling the linen tight, her hands working with a speed and confidence that felt like it belonged to someone else. She had done it. She had patched up a wounded warrior in the middle of a battle. She gave Taza a long drink from her waterskin. He looked at her, his face pale, but the hostility in his eyes was gone. It was replaced by a look of stunned, grudging respect. The gunfire outside had lessened. She heard Boone shouting, his voice hoarse. "That is it! We are done! Grab the wounded! We are retreating! Fall back to the mouth!" Lena heard the sounds of men scrambling, dragging their wounded comrades, the panic clear in their voices. She peered out of the alcove. The smoke was clearing. She saw the posse, or what was left of it, disappearing back the way they had come, leaving 2 bodies and 3 dead horses on the canyon floor. One man had stopped. He was standing 20 yards away, staring at her alcove. It was Thomas Reed. His face was streaked with black powder. His hat was gone, and his heroic demeanor had been replaced by the raw, pale fear of a man who had nearly died. He was staring, his mouth open, at her. He saw the blood on her apron. He saw the wounded Apache warrior leaning against the rock behind her. "Lena!" he shouted, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Lena, my God, what are you doing? You are with them. You are helping a savage." He raised his rifle, his hands shaking. He looked at her not as a woman to be rescued, but as a creature he could not comprehend. Lena stepped out from the cover of the rocks. She stood up straight, her hands, covered in Taza's blood, balled into fists at her side. Her fear was gone, burned away by a cold, clarifying rage. "He was shot. Thomas," she called back, her voice ringing clear and true against the stone walls. "I am standing with the people who saved my life, not with the liars who came here to murder them in the name of a rescue." Thomas's face crumpled. This was not how it was supposed to happen. She was not supposed to be defiant. She was supposed to be grateful, terrified. He looked at her, at this plain, blood-streaked woman, and he felt a burning, profound sense of betrayal. "You," he stammered, his mind unable to form the words. "You are one of them. You are a traitor." One of the other retreating posse members, a man Lena recognized from the saloon, saw Thomas hesitating. He saw Lena. He saw the wounded warrior. "She is with them! Read!" the man yelled, leveling his own rifle. "She is Hawk's woman. She is one of them. Kill her!" He took aim. Lena saw the dark muzzle of the rifle. She saw the man's eyes squint as he sighted her. She did not have time to move. A dark shape launched itself from a low ledge, a ledge Lena had not even known was there. It was a hawk. He hit her like a thunderbolt, his voice a guttural roar. He did not tackle her to the ground. He slammed into her, his body taking the full force of the impact, driving her backward, pinning her against the sheer, hard face of the canyon wall. Thwack, thwack. 2 bullets struck the stone exactly where she had been standing, sending stinging chips of rock exploding against her back. She was trapped, crushed between the unyielding stone and Hawk's even harder body. Her breath was driven from her lungs in a sharp whoosh. Her face was pressed against his chest, her senses overwhelmed by the smell of him gunpowder, sweat, horse, and the sharp, clean scent of the high desert pine. His body was a living shield, tense as a drawn bowstring, covering her completely. His heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic, powerful rhythm that she felt in her own chest. His arm was a band of iron around her waist, holding her so tightly to him, and to the rock, that she could not draw a breath. He was breathing in harsh, ragged gasps, his hot breath stirring her hair. For a long, ringing moment, the entire world stopped. The gunfire ceased. The posse was gone. There was only the echo of the last shot, the dust settling in the air, and the frantic, mingled sound of their breathing. He eased his weight off her, but he did not step back. His hands were on her shoulders, his fingers digging into her skin, holding her pinned to the rock. He was scanning the mouth of the canyon, his eyes blazing with a cold, terrifying fire. "They are gone," Noche's voice called from the rim above. "Running!" Hawk did not look up. He looked down at her. His face was inches from her own. His dark eyes were stormy, and in their depths, she saw something that shocked her more than the gunfire. She saw raw, undiluted fear. "I told you," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp, a growl that came from deep in his chest. "I told you to stay at the camp." He was not angry, he was furious, but not at her. He was furious at the bullets. Lena could not find her voice. She stared up at him, her hands flat against the hard muscle of his chest, her mind reeling. He looked at her, his gaze intense, as if he were seeing her for the first time. His hand, shaking slightly, moved to her face. His thumb, calloused and rough, brushed a streak of rock dust from her cheek. The touch was electric, rough and gentle all at once. Then, as if he had been burned, he snatched his hand back. He stepped away from her, and the cold morning air rushed into the space where his warmth had been. He turned his back to her, breathing deeply, mastering himself. He looked down the canyon at the fading cloud of dust from the retreating posse. Noche and Taza, who were leaning heavily on his friend, made their way down the rocks to join them. "They will be back," Hawk said, his voice flat and cold again, the moment of vulnerability gone. "This time, they will not bring a posse. They will bring the army." He did not follow them. He had made his point. He had protected his home, but he knew, and Lena knew, this was not an ending. It was the beginning of a war. The posse's retreat was a rout, a panicked scramble of men and horses, leaving a trail of abandoned rifles and blood in the dust. Hawk and Noche watched from the rim until they were gone. Taza, his side bound tightly by Lena's linen, was breathing in shallow, pained gasps. but the bleeding had slowed. Lena's hands were shaking so violently, she had to clench them into fists to make them stop. The adrenaline that had turned her into a battlefield nurse was draining away, leaving her cold and sick. Hawk slid down the last of the rock face, landing silently on the canyon floor. He did not look at her. He walked to Taza and spoke in low, rapid Apache. Taza, his face pale and slick with sweat, answered, his gaze flickering to Lena. Hawk nodded, his face grim. He looked at the blood on Lena's apron, then at the neat, tight bandage she had applied. He turned to her, his voice flat. You saved his life. The stone was poisoned by the lead of the bullet. You took it out clean. Lena just nodded, unable to speak. She felt a strange, light-headed sense of pride, immediately followed by a wave of nausea. They will be back, he said again, his voice echoing his words from before. They will not come back to this canyon. They will go to the main camp, to my aunt, to the children. They think I am a captive, Lena said, her voice a hoarse whisper. Thomas saw me. He called me a traitor, but Whitlock's story is that I was stolen. They will come to rescue me. They will use your name, Hawk said, his eyes cold, as they burn our homes. He, Taza, and Noche retrieved the bodies of the 2 posse members who had been killed. They did not scalp them. They did not strip them. They laid them respectfully against the canyon wall, side by side. We are not the savages he says we are, Hawk said, more to himself than to her. They returned to the basin, the small, hidden camp, to find it empty and cold. The fire was dead. The children, the old woman, the extra horses, all were gone, vanished into the high mountains. The silence of the place was terrifying. It was no longer a home. It was a target. 2 days passed. Lena, Hawk, Taza, and Noche lived in the silent, empty camp like ghosts. They ate cold jerky and the last of Lena's cornbread, never lighting a fire, never speaking above a whisper. Hawk and Noche were gone for hours at a time, scouting the ridges, their faces growing harder, their silence deeper. Lena tended to Taza's wound, which was healing clean, the flesh knitting back together without the telltale red streaks of poison. On the 3rd morning, Noche appeared on the ridge, not with a signal of all clear, but with a warning. A moment later, riders entered the basin. This was not a panicked posse. It was an official delegation. Marshal Boone was in the lead, his shotgun held across his saddle. With him were 4 other men, all wearing deputy stars. Their fate is set and grim. Thomas Reed was not with them. They stopped their horses 20 yards from the cabin. Hawk stepped out into the open, his rifle held loosely in one hand, his body relaxed but ready. Hawk, Boone said, his voice flat. He did not look at Hawk. His eyes were scanning the camp, looking for Lena. We are not here for a fight. We are here for the woman, Miss Cartwright. Lena, hearing her name, stepped out of the cabin and into the sunlight. She stood beside Hawk, her apron still stained with Taza's blood. Boone's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He had not expected her to be standing, unharmed, next to the savage. Miss Cartwright, Boone said, his voice heavy. The town is in an uproar. Judge Whitlock is holding a community hearing this afternoon to determine the truth of what happened in the canyon and to decide what action must be taken. I already told the truth, Lena said, her voice clear. Boone's gaze flickered. Your testimony is required. As the victim. I am not the victim, Lena said. That is for the hearing to decide, Boone said, his patience clearly wearing thin. Judge Whitlock has requested your presence to give your account. You will be provided with safe passage to the church and safe passage back here, if you choose. It was a lie, and everyone in the basin knew it. It was a summons, not a request. Hawk took a half step in front of Lena. She is not going. If she does not come, Boone said, his voice dropping, the judge will take that as proof that she is a captive, and he will send the cavalry. Not me, and they will not stop to ask questions. This is your one chance to speak. Hawk, through her. It was a perfect trap. If Lena stayed, they were all branded guilty, and the army would come. If she went. She was walking into the judge's courtroom, a room where he was the law, the judge, and the jury. Lena looked at Hawk. She saw the storm in his eyes, the fury. He was caught. He could not protect her from this. "I will go," Lena said. Hawk turned to her, his jaw tight. "Lena, no, it is a trick. They will not let you leave." "I know," she said softly, looking up at him. "But I will not be the reason they burn your home. I will not be their excuse. You heard what Thomas called me. You heard the lies. I will go, and I will tell them what I saw." She touched his arm. A brief, light touch. "I will speak the truth, whether they believe it or not." Hawk looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a helpless rage. He gave a single, sharp nod. "She will go," he said to Boone, "and I will be waiting. If she is not returned, as you promised, there is no place in this territory you will be able to hide." The ride back to Dusty Creek was a silent, tense affair. Lena rode her own lame mule, which Hawk had found and brought back to the camp. She rode in the center of the deputies, a prisoner disguised as a guest of honor. As they entered the main street, the town went silent. People came out of the saloon, the mercantile, the smithy's shop. They stared. They saw Lena Cartwright, their plain, cast-off cook, riding in from the wilderness, her hair uncombed, her dress dirty, her apron stained with blood. She was not the weeping, rescued captive they had been told to expect. She looked hard, tired, and angry. They took her to the church. It was not the small, quiet building she remembered. It was packed. Every pew was full. Men stood 3 deep along the walls, their hats in their hands. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, tobacco, and a self-righteous fury. Mrs. Sloane was in the front pew, next to Mrs. Boone, her face a mask of bitter condemnation. At the front, where the pulpit should be, Judge Whitlock sat at a heavy oak table. Marshal Boone sat on one side of him. On the other side, looking pale but resolute, was Thomas Reed. This was not a hearing. It was a show. Lena was escorted to the front pew and told to sit. She was alone, a single, small island in a sea of hostile faces. Judge Whitlock stood up. He clasped his hands, his face a perfect mask of grave, paternal concern. "My friends," he began, his voice filling the hushed room, "we are gathered here today in a time of great peril. We are here to seek justice. We are here to protect the sanctity of our homes, the progress of our great nation, and the virtue of our women." He paused, letting the words hang. "A few days ago, a posse of our own brave citizens, led by Marshal Boone and Deputy Reed, went on a mission of mercy, a mission to investigate the camp of the known renegade, Ravenhawk, and to rescue a woman of our town, Miss Lena Cartwright, who we had reason to believe was taken against her will." A low murmur of agreement rumbled through the crowd. "That mission of mercy," Whitlock continued, his voice dropping, "was met with a brutal, savage, and unprovoked ambush. 2 of our citizens were murdered in cold blood. 3 more were wounded. Our men were forced to retreat from an overwhelming force of Apache warriors, led by Hawk himself." The murmur grew louder, angrier. "We are here to hear the testimony of the man who led that heroic charge, and of the woman at the center of this storm. Deputy Reed, please tell us what you saw." Thomas Reed stood up. He was wearing his best uniform. He looked at the crowd, at his new fiancée, Annabelle, who was watching him with wide, tear-filled eyes. He did not look at Lena. It was a massacre," Thomas began, his voice shaking with well-practiced emotion. "We rode into that canyon calling Miss Cartwright's name. We were there in peace. And they opened fire from the rocks. It was a slaughter. They shot down Jeb and Hank before they could even draw their guns. They were Savages. Yelling, screaming. It was a hawk. He was leading them. And Miss Cartwright Whitlock asked gently. Thomas, finally, reluctantly, looked at Lena. His face hardened. She was there, but she was not the Lena we knew. She was with them. She was helping one of them, a wounded savage. She spoke against us. She called us liars. A collective gasp went up from the women in the pews. Thomas pressed on, his voice rising, feeding on their horror. I do not know what he did to her, whether it was fear or some kind of Indian magic, but she is bewitched. She has been turned. She is not one of us anymore. He sat down, his performance complete. He was the tragic hero. His former fiancée lost not just to a savage, but to his savagery. All eyes turned to Lena. She felt the weight of their gaze like a physical thing, a heavy, suffocating blanket. Miss Cartwright, Judge Whitlock said, his voice dripping with a terrible, false pity. Please, stand. Come forward. Lena's knees were shaking so badly she did not think she could stand. She gripped the back of the pew in front of her. She thought of Hawk, of his cold fury. She thought of Taza, his face pale with pain. She thought of her skillet, and the fire, and the look in the old woman's eyes. She stood. She walked slowly, her footsteps echoing in the silence. To the front of the church, she stood alone, facing the table, facing the entire town. My dear child, Whitlock said, leaning forward, we know you have suffered a terrible ordeal. We know you are not yourself. Just tell us the truth. Tell us how this man, Hawk, abducted you. Tell us how he forced you to serve his war party. Tell us, so we can bring the army, and we can bring you home. He was giving her the lie. He was offering her an easy way out. All she had to do was nod, to weep, to play the victim. Lena looked at Judge Whitlock. She looked at Thomas, who was staring at his own hands. She looked at the crowd. I was not abducted, she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was so clear, so sharp. It cut through the silence like a knife. Whitlock's smile faltered. What? What did you say, child? You are confused. I said I was not abducted, Lena repeated, her voice stronger. I was thrown out, from the boarding house, by Mrs. Sloane, on your orders. Judge Whitlock. She called me an old maid. You called me hysterical. I was left in the street with nothing. A shocked murmur rippled through the pews. Mrs. Sloane went pale. I left town, Lena continued, her voice gaining power with every word, with a lame mule and a broken wagon. The wagon broke. I was stranded in a sandstorm. I was going to die. And Ravenhawk, he found me. He saved my life. She is lying, someone shouted from the back. And the wagon train, Lena said, her voice rising over the noise. The first ambush. It was not Apache, it was white men. I told Marshal Boone. I told Deputy Reed. I told all of you they were wearing city boots. I heard their leader speak. He said, Judge Whitlock just wants a scare. The church erupted. Men were on their feet, shouting. Whitlock was banging a gavel on the table, his face turning a dark, mottled red. Order, order. The woman is clearly mad. And the fight in the canyon, Lena shouted, her words tumbling out, a dam of truth finally breaking. It was not an ambush. It was a defense. You! She pointed a trembling, blood-stained finger at Thomas. You rode into their home. You came to murder them, to rescue a woman who did not need rescuing. I was there. I saw it. They defended their camp. They defended me. She was breathing hard, her whole body shaking, not with fear, but with a terrible, cleansing rage. If he wanted to kill me, she said, her voice dropping, but still carrying to every corner of the room. He had two chances. When I was stranded in the desert, when his camp was attacked, he saved me. Both times. A woman's voice, high and shrill, cut through the stunned silence. It was Mrs. Boone. So what are you saying, Miss Cartwright, that you are living with him? A white woman, living with a savage, unmarried, without the word of God. This was the real question, the one that mattered more than ambushes or lies. Lena felt the heat rise in her face, a deep, painful blush. She looked at the horrified, condemning faces of the women in the front pews. She lifted her chin. "Yes," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. I cook for them. I earn my keep with the only skill I have." She looked directly at Mrs. Sloane, at Thomas, at the whole town, and I am treated with more respect in that canyon than I ever was in this entire town. The room exploded. It was a scandal. It was a confession. The women were aghast, their faces masks of pure, moral horror. The men were shouting, some in anger, some in a new, confused doubt. A few men in the back, the ones who drank at the saloon and worked on the railroad, were looking at Judge Whitlock with the narrow, calculating eyes. They had seen his deals before. Lena's story, as wild as it was, had the ring of truth. Judge Whitlock saw it. He saw the doubt. He saw his perfect, righteous war slipping away. He slammed his gavel down. "Silence," he roared, his voice no longer paternal, but a raw, ugly sound of pure power. He stood up, pointing a shaking finger at Lena. He abandoned all pretense of a hearing. This is a travesty," he bellowed. "This is not testimony. This is a confession of degradation, of sin." He turned to the crowd, his face a mask of moral outrage. "We do not need to listen to this. This woman's testimony is worthless. She stands here, by her own admission, a fallen woman. She has abandoned her race, her virtue, her God, to live in sin with a savage. What can we expect from such a person but lies? Lies to protect her, her red-skinned lover." The word hung in the air, ugly and final. He had done it. He had taken her truth and twisted it into the one thing the town could not forgive. She was not a witness. She was not a victim. She was a whore. Lena had spoken her truth, and society, led by Whitlock, had just branded her a whore for it. The word Judge Whitlock had used, that single, ugly word, hung in the air of the church, thick and poisonous as smoke. It had done its job perfectly. The flicker of doubt that Lena had sparked in the crowd, the questions about the faked ambush, all of it was extinguished, smothered by a new, more powerful, and more satisfying wave of moral outrage. The real crime, the one they could all understand, was not the lie, it was the sin. A whore, a woman shrieked from the pews. It was Mrs. Sloane, her face purple with righteous venom. She admits it. She is unclean. "She is a traitor to her race," another man shouted, standing up, his fists clenched. "She is no better than a savage herself." The room, which had been balanced on a knife edge of confusion, now tipped entirely into a mob. Men surged to their feet. The raw, violent energy that Whitlock had been trying to build all week finally had its focus. It was not just about land anymore. It was about sin. It was about punishment. "We should run them out," a man yelled from the back. "Run them all out." "Hang him," another voice roared, a sound thick with whiskey and hate. "Hang Hawk, he has polluted one of our own. Get a rope ride out to that camp and hang every last one of them." "Burn the camp, Mrs." Boone cried, her face a mask of hysteria. "Burn it to the ground. We cannot have that filth so close to decent folk." Marshal Boone saw the look in their eyes. This was no longer a hearing. It was a lynch mob. He had to take control, to channel this rage, or the whole town would explode. He drew his shotgun from its scabbard, resting the heavy weapon in the crook of his arm. "Enough," he bellowed, his voice silencing the room. "The judge is right. The woman's testimony is compromised. She is clearly under the savage's influence." He looked at Whitlock, a grim, unspoken understanding passing between them. "Judge, this settles it. I am forming a posse, a real one. We rode out within the hour. We will bring back Hawk, dead or alive, and we will cleanse that canyon." Thomas Reed, who had been sitting with his head in his hands, looked up, his face pale and sick. This was not a heroic rescue. This was an execution sanctioned by a lie, but he was trapped. He saw his new fiancée watching him, her eyes wide with fear and admiration for his bravery. He stood up slowly. I will get the rifles from the office," he stammered. Men began to push for the doors, their faces eager, their voices loud. "Get kerosene from the mercantile. Someone find a good rope." The church was no longer a house of God. It was the gathering place for a holy war. And then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the church slammed open, banging against the walls with a sound like a cannon shot. The entire mob froze. The men nearest the door, who had been pushing their way out, stumbled backward, scrambling to get away from the entrance. A single shaft of bright, blinding afternoon sun cut through the dusty, hate-filled air of the church. Silhouetted in the doorway, a tall, dark figure, was Ravenhawk. He was alone. He stood there for a long moment, letting them see him. He wore his dark buckskins, his long knife sheathed at his hip, his 2 old Colts holstered and tied down. He carried no rifle. His hands were empty, hanging loose at his sides. He had not come for a war. He had come to stop one. He took one step inside, then another, his moccasins making no sound on the wooden floor. The crowd parted for him like the sea, men and women pushing themselves back into the pews, falling over each other, their faces a mixture of raw terror and stunned disbelief. They were afraid to breathe, afraid to touch him. He walked down the central aisle. He walked past the horrified, gasping face of Mrs. Sloane. He walked past the men whose hands were itching for a rope. He walked as if he were alone, his gaze fixed on the front of the church. Lena, who had been standing frozen, her hands over her mouth, let out a sound, a half-sob, half-gasp. "Hawk," she whispered, a desperate, frantic sound. "No, go, you cannot be here. Go back, please." He did not look at her. He continued walking until he stopped, 10 feet from the table where Whitlock, Boone, and Thomas stood, all 3 men frozen in a tableau of shock. Hawk slowly, calmly, raised his gaze and looked at the stunned, silent crowd. His eyes were cold, but they held no fear. "You want a hanging," he said. His voice was not loud, but it was low and rough, and it filled every corner of the silent church. "You are angry. You want justice for your 2 dead men." He paused, and his gaze swept the room again. "If you need a neck to quiet your anger," he said, his voice clear, "then take mine." He touched his own throat with 2 fingers. "But you will leave the women and the children in the hills alone. They have done nothing. They are not part of this. Your fight is with me." The church was utterly, profoundly silent. The sheer, impossible bravery of the act had stunned them, robbing them of their rage. This was not the creeping, skulking savage of their stories. This was a man, standing alone, offering his life to a room full of his enemies. Judge Whitlock was the first to recover. He saw his advantage. This was a gift. He confesses, Whitlock shrieked, his voice high and thin. He admits it. He is a murderer, Marshal Boone. What are you waiting for? Arrest him. Arrest this killer. Marshal Boone stood up slowly. His hand was on the grip of his holstered revolver, but he did not draw it. He was a hard man, but he was not a coward, and he was staring at Hawk with a new, grudging, and deeply confused respect. This was not the man he had been told he was hunting. Hawk ignored Boone. His burning, dark gaze settled on Judge Whitlock. "I am not a murderer," Hawk said, his voice a low growl. "I am a man who defended his home, as any man in this room would do." He took one step closer. "But you, Judge, you are a liar, and you are a murderer." Whitlock's face went pale. "How dare you, you savage! You will be hanged for that." "You want to talk about ambushes?" Hawk continued, his voice cutting through Whitlock's protests. "Let us talk about the first one, the one in the Red Bluffs, the one that Miss Cartwright spoke of." Lena, who had been watching, her heart in her throat, flinched. "The one with white men, dressed in paint," Hawk said, his voice like stones. "The one where the leader wore city boots. The one where he told his men, 'Judge Whitlock just wants a scare.'" "Lies," Whitlock bellowed, but his voice was shaking. More lies from a fallen woman and her savage lover. "Was it a lie?" Hawk asked, his voice deceptively soft. "Was it a lie when the leader of that raid, a man from the east who works for your railroad, a man named Miller, was there?" Hawk's gaze suddenly shifted from Whitlock. It swept the crowd, scanning the faces in the back pews. "A man," Hawk said, his voice rising, "who is sitting right there, in the back row, hiding behind the smithy." He pointed. 100 heads turned as one. In the back of the church, a man in a surveyor's vest, a man with a pale, eastern face, was trying to push his way to the door. "Stop him!" someone yelled. The surveyor, Miller, froze. He looked like he had been shot. He was trapped, every eye in the room on him. "He is lying," Miller stammered, his hands raised. "I do not know what he is talking about. I was not there." "You were there," Lena's voice suddenly rang out, sharp and clear. She was pointing at him, her entire body shaking. "I heard your voice. You were the one who yelled at the other man. You were the one who said Judge Whitlock's name." The two testimonies, from the savage and the whore, hit Miller from both sides. He was caught. His eyes darted to Whitlock, pleading for help. Judge Whitlock's face was a mask of cold, white stone. He offered nothing. Miller crumbled. The terror was too much. No, he stammered, looking at the hard, angry faces of the men around him. Men who had been ready to lynch someone just moments before. "Please, I just did what he told me. It was his order." He pointed a shaking finger at the front of the church, at Judge Whitlock. "It was just a scare," he said. "He said no one would get hurt. It was just to scare the railroad men, to get the army here." It was his order. The confession hung in the dead, absolute silence of the church. Then, a low, ugly sound began in the pews. It was not a shout. It was a murmur, a growl. "His orders, he faked it, Jeb and Hank. They died for a lie." The entire crowd, the entire mob, turned. They were no longer looking at Hawk. They were no longer looking at Lena. They were looking at Judge Whitlock, the man who owned their land, the man who held their banknotes, the man who had just lied to them, used them, and gotten 2 of their own killed, all to start a war for his own profit. Marshal Boone looked at Whitlock, his face a dark, furious red. He had been played for a fool. He had led a posse to its death. His reputation, his authority, it was all shattered. He looked at Whitlock, and he looked at the mob, and he hesitated. Judge Whitlock saw it all. He saw Boone's hesitation. He saw Miller's blubbering, terrified confession. He saw the faces of the town, the trust and fear he had cultivated, turning to a cold, murderous rage. It was over. His power, his reputation, his entire world was evaporating in the space of a single heartbeat. His face, which had been red with anger, went a terrible, waxy white. His eyes were wide, staring. He was a cornered animal. "You," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. He looked at Hawk. He looked at Lena. "You, savage, you, whore, you have ruined me." His hand, which had been resting on the table, dropped to his side. In a flash of motion, he pulled a small, silver derringer from his waistcoat pocket. It was not a lawman's gun. It was a gambler's, an assassin's. He aimed it, not at Miller, but at the source of his ruin, at Ravenhawk. "You have ruined me," he screamed, his voice a high, thin shriek. And he fired. The sound was small, a sharp pop, almost comically tiny in the cavernous church. Hawk had been watching Boone. He had not expected the attack to come from the judge. The bullet, small as it was, hit him high in the right shoulder. The impact was enough to spin him half around. A low grunt of pure, shocked breath was forced from his lungs. His knees buckled. He did not fall slowly. He collapsed, crashing to the wooden floor like a felled tree. The church exploded into chaos. Women screamed, a sound of pure terror. Men dove for the floors, overturning pews, convinced a battle had begun. Lena did not scream. She did not run. She saw Hawk fall. She saw Whitlock, his face a mask of insane, triumphant rage, raise the small, smoking pistol again, steadying it with both hands, aiming for Hawk's head as he lay on the floor. "No," Lena screamed, a sound that was not a word, but a roar, a sound of such pure, animal fury that it cut through the panic. She ran. She did not think. She launched herself across the few feet of open space and threw her body over Hawk, shielding his back and head with her own. She stared at Whitlock, her arms spread wide, her hair wild, her face a mask of defiance. "Enough!" she shrieked at him. "Enough!" Whitlock was about to fire again, to shoot her in the back and finish the man beneath her. But another figure, who had been frozen at the table, finally moved. Thomas Reed. He had watched his entire world disintegrate. He had lied to Whitlock. He had lost Lena. He had become a man he despised. And now he watched as that same man, his boss, his patron, raised a gun to murder the woman he had once sworn to protect. He did not think. He reacted. He lunged, not at Whitlock, but at the gun. "No more," Thomas yelled, his voice cracking. You will not kill her!" He slammed his body into the judge, grabbing the older man's arm, twisting it up and away. The two men struggled, stumbling over an overturned pew. Whitlock was screaming, a high, thin, animal sound, still trying to bring the gun to bear. Let me go, they ruined me, they all deserved it. Thomas, younger and stronger, fueled by a sudden, desperate need for one, single, redeeming act, slammed Whitlock's hand against the edge of the oak table. The derringer clattered loudly to the floor. Whitlock's energy vanished. He collapsed, all the fight gone, and fell to his knees, a broken, weeping old man. Marshal Boone, his face like thunder, finally moved. He saw his town in chaos, his authority in tatters. He strode forward and grabbed Judge Whitlock by the collar, hauling him to his feet with one arm. "Judge Whitlock," Boone said, his voice a low, cold growl that carried over the sudden, shocked silence. "You are under arrest, for incitement, for the murders of Jeb and Hank, and for attempted murder, in a house of God." The crowd was silent, stunned. They watched, their mouths open, as Marshal Boone, with a pale and shaking Thomas Reed at his side, dragged the weeping, protesting, powerless old man out of the church. Lena did not watch them go. She ignored it all. She was on her knees, her hands frantic, turning Hawk over. "Hawk," she whispered, her voice desperate. "Raven, oh God, speak to me." He was breathing, his face a pale, ashen gray, his teeth gritted against a pain she could not imagine. The front of his buckskin shirt was a dark, wet, rapidly spreading stain. The bullet had gone deep. He looked up at her, his dark eyes clouded with pain, but they were focused, intense. He reached up with his left hand, his good hand, and grabbed her forearm. His grip was a vice, surprisingly, terrifyingly strong. "Lena," he breathed, his voice a raw rasp, a bare whisper. "I am here," she wept, her tears finally coming, hot and fast, dripping from her face onto his. "I am here. It is all right." "Do not," he whispered, his eyes holding hers. "Do not let them write this story." His fingers tightened. "Our story." Lena looked down at his hand, his dark, strong fingers gripping her pale, freckled arm. She looked at the blood, his blood, pooling on the floor of the church. She looked at the stunned, silent, horrified faces of the townspeople, who were all watching her. She understood. Her place was not just at the stove. It was here. It was to be the voice, to be the memory. "I will not," she whispered, her tears falling, but her voice was as steady as iron. "I promise, I will not let them." The chaos in the church did not last long. It collapsed in on itself, consumed by the greater, heavier weight of shock and shame. The mob, which only moments before had been howling for a rope, dissolved into a collection of pale, stunned individuals who could not meet one another's eyes. They stood frozen, watching as Marshal Boone, his face a mask of cold fury, dragged the weeping, broken form of Judge Whitlock from the building. They watched as Thomas Reed, his face the color of ash, followed him, his eyes fixed on the floor, a man walking in his own private shame. Then the church was silent. All that remained was the overturned furniture, the dust motes dancing in the beam of sunlight, and the small, desperate group kneeling on the floor. Lena's hands were covered in Hawk's blood. "He is bleeding. He is bleeding too much," she said, her voice a high, thin sound of panic. "We have to stop it." Thomas Reed re-entered the church, his steps heavy. He stood over them, looking down at the man he had been sent to kill, the man who was now bleeding to death on the church floor, and the woman he had abandoned, who was now shielding that man with her body. "He is right," a new voice said. It was Twig, the saloon owner. He had been standing in the back the whole time, watching. He stepped forward, his face grim. "We cannot treat him here, not after this. Half the town still wants to hang him, and the other half is too scared." "Help me," Lena said, looking up at Thomas. Her gaze was not a plea. It was a command. "You did this. You helped him. You will help me fix it." Thomas winced as if she had struck him, but he nodded. "What do we do?" "We get him out of town," Twig said, already moving. "We get him back to his own people. It is the only chance he has." It was a strange, grim procession that left Dusty Creek, Hawk, unconscious now. His face, a waxy, pale gray, was lashed to his own black horse. Lena rode beside him, her hand gripping his, her own mule forgotten. Thomas rode in front, his rifle across his saddle, and Twig rode behind. They were no longer a posse. They were an escort. The town watched them go. Mrs. Boone, her face white, pulled her children inside and bolted the door. Mrs. Sloane watched from the window of the boarding house, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with a new, terrible understanding. No one spoke. No one tried to stop them. The town, in its silent, collective shame, let them go. They rode hard, Thomas pushing them, taking the most direct route back to the basin. When they arrived, the camp was just as they had left it, cold and silent. But as they carried Hawk's limp body from the horse, a figure emerged from the high rocks. It was Hawk's aunt. She had been watching, waiting. She had not gone far. Her eyes took in the scene, her nephew, gray and dying, and the white woman, her hands and dress covered in his blood. The old woman let out a low, guttural wail, a sound of such profound grief and rage that Lena's knees buckled. But there was no time for grief. The old woman's eyes snapped to Lena, then to the wound. She barked an order in Apache, pointing to the cabin. For the next 4 days, the world shrank to the size of the small, smoky cabin. The old woman and Lena, 2 women who shared no language and no history, became a single, grimly determined unit. They were bound by one purpose: to keep the flame of life from guttering out. Hawk's aunt was the healer. She disappeared into the canyons and returned with armloads of plants Lena did not recognize. She chewed a bitter root and packed the dark, seeping wound in his shoulder, her hands, though ancient, moving with a surgeon's certainty. She boiled a dark, acrid tea from leaves and forced it between his lips. Lena was the nurse. She was the firekeeper, the water boiler, the nurse. She tore her own spare dress and her aprons into long, clean strips, boiling them in her own iron stew pot until they were sterile. She sat by his side, hour after hour, wiping the sweat from his brow, her own hands stained with the herbs and poultices the old woman prepared. The fever came, as she knew it would. It came on the second night, a raging, consuming heat that seemed to burn the very life from him. He became delirious, his strong body thrashing against the furs, his voice a low, rough rasp, speaking in a jumble of languages. He spoke in Apache, his voice sharp with commands. He spoke in Spanish, words of soft comfort that made Lena's heart ache. And he spoke in English, his voice tight with a cold fury. "The lie," he muttered, his eyes rolling, seeing things she could not. "They build on a lie. They are a house of dust." Lena gripped his good hand, his left hand, holding on as if she could anchor him to the world. "I am here," she whispered, her voice raw from lack of sleep. "I am here. Raven, it is all right. You are safe." She talked to him. She did not know if he could hear her, but she talked because the silence was too much like death. She told him about her childhood, about her mother's garden, about the first bread she ever baked. She told him about her dream of her own eatery, a small, clean place where the food was honest. And when her own stories ran out, she whispered his promise back to him. "You cannot go. You hear me. You cannot die. We have to tell the story. Our story. You promised. Raven, do not let them write it." In those long, dark, smoke-filled hours, Lena looked at this man, the most feared man in the territory, and saw only the terrible vulnerability of a body fighting for its life. She measured his breath against her own. She saw the scar on his cheek, no longer a mark of fear, but just a part of his face. She had been the rejected woman. Now, she was a guardian, a lifesaver, the keeper of the fire. She had found her voice in the church, but she found her strength here, in the quiet, desperate dark. Hawk, in his delirium, fought his own battles. He saw Whitlock's face, and Thomas's, but mostly he saw the lie, the endless, suffocating lie that had defined his life. He was the savage, the half-breed, the killer. He had spent his entire life in the silence of the canyons, avoiding that lie, letting it fester. But now the lie had come into his home. It had shot him. It had nearly killed the woman who had, for some reason, chosen to stand with him. He realized, in the hot fog of the fever, that his silence had been a weapon, but it was one he had been using against himself. He could not just avoid it. He had to speak. He had to fight their words with his own. On the 5th morning, the fever broke. Lena had fallen asleep, her head resting on the edge of his cot, her hand still clutching his. She woke with a start when his fingers moved, curling to grip hers. She looked up. His eyes were open. They were clear. The fever was gone. He was weak, his face hollowed out and pale beneath his copper skin. But he was him. He looked at her. He saw her, truly saw her. Her hair was a tangled mat, her face smudged with soot and exhaustion. She was wearing a rough buckskin shirt Taza had given her own dress long since sacrificed for bandages. He said nothing. He simply looked at her, and in his gaze, she saw a raw, profound gratitude that was more powerful than any words. She let out a sob, a single, choked sound of pure relief, and laid her head down on his hand, her tears, the tears she had held back for days, finally soaking his skin. He just lay there, his fingers weak, and stroked her hair. 2 days later, a rider approached the camp. Taza, who was guarding the entrance, raised his rifle, then lowered it. It was Thomas Reed. He rode in alone, his hands empty, held high. He dismounted, his face gaunt and exhausted. He looked, Lena thought, like a man who had not slept in a week. He was carrying a saddlebag. He stopped at a respectful distance from the cabin. Lena stepped out into the sunlight. Her eyes narrowed. "Lena," he said, his voice rough. He did not look at her. He looked at the ground. I brought things." He opened the saddlebag. Inside was a bottle of good whiskey, a bag of real coffee beans, a small bag of white sugar, and, wrapped in cloth, a bottle of laudanum. "For the pain," he said, gesturing to the bottle. "And the coffee? I figured you might like it." Lena just stared at him. Thomas finally raised his eyes. They were the eyes of a broken man. I testified. "Lena," he said, his voice low, "I told the circuit judge, who came in on the train. I told him everything, about Miller, about the first ambush, about Whitlock's orders, about the meeting in the church. Miller, he confessed to everything. He is going to prison. So is Boone. For helping." "And Judge Whitlock?" Lena asked, her voice cold. "He is in chains," Thomas said. "They are taking him to the territorial prison in Santa Fe. He will hang, or rot in there. He is ruined. The railroad company has disowned him. His name is Mud." He stood there, shifting his weight, a man with no purpose. "I came," he said, the words a painful confession, "to tell you that, and to tell you I am sorry." "Sorry for what, Thomas?" she asked. "Sorry for lying? Sorry for trying to get us all killed?" "Yes," he said, his voice cracking. "All of that, but mostly, I am sorry for what I did to you. Years ago, I was a fool. I was a young, vain, ambitious fool." He shook his head, a look of profound self-disgust on his face. I wanted power. I wanted what Whitlock had. I wanted to be important. And he knew it. He used me. And I let him." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. You were always good. Lena, your bread was good. Your heart was good. I was too stupid to see it. I thought pretty was what mattered." Lena looked at him, at the man she had once thought she loved, the man who had broken her heart. She felt nothing, no anger, no pity, just a vast, empty distance. "Go home, Thomas," she said, her voice tired. "It is over." I am turning in my star," he said, fumbling at his vest. "I am leaving Dusty Creek. I am not a lawyer." "That is a good choice," Lena said. She took the coffee and the laudanum from his bag. "Thank you for this. It will help him." He nodded. His shoulders slumped. He mounted his horse and rode away, a man vanishing into the desert he had never understood. Inside the camp, life slowly returned. Hawk's aunt brought the children back. Taza and Noche returned to their patrols, their expressions toward Lena no longer suspicious, but filled with a fierce, protective respect. The news from Dusty Creek had spread. The Apache War was now the Whitlock conspiracy. The army, which had been preparing to ride, stood down. Investigators from the railroad, desperate to avoid a scandal, were suddenly very interested in making peace. One evening, Hawk, his arm in a sling made from Lena's dress, sat by the fire, his aunt on one side, Taza and Noche on the other. They were speaking in Apache, their voices low and serious. Taza was angry, his voice sharp. He wanted revenge. He gestured toward the town. Noche was practical. He spoke of moving north, of finding new lands. Hawk listened. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of his new authority. He spoke of the lie. He said they could not run from it. He said that running proved the lie was true. He said they had to stay. They had to face the white men, not with arrows, but with truth. He would be the bridge. He would speak. Lena did not understand the words, but she understood the meaning. She moved among them, quietly, filling their bowls with a thick, rich rabbit stew. Her presence, the simple, domestic act of a shared meal, was its own argument. It was an argument for home, for family, For a future, not for war. Later that night, the camp was asleep. The air was clear and cold, and the sky was a black velvet blanket, punched through with 1,000,000 diamond-hard stars. Lena was sitting on the rock outside the cabin, wrapped in the buffalo hide. Hawk, moving stiffly, came and sat beside her. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the river of stars flow overhead. "Thomas Reed told me you are a hero in the town," Hawk said, his voice a low rumble in the dark. "The woman who spoke the truth. The railroad investigators want to speak to you. You could go back. You have a place there now. They would listen to you." Lena looked up at the vast, cold sweep of the Milky Way. "Go back," she said, her voice soft. "To what?" "To a town that needed a man to be shot before they would listen to one word I said to Mrs. Sloane, who will smile at me now, but still thinks I am a plain old maid to those walls." She shook her head, a small, definite motion. "I spent my whole life in rooms like that. Hawk, I was always not enough, not pretty enough, not quiet enough, not good enough. I was a ghost they all looked through." She turned her head, looking at him in the starlight. His face was in shadow, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze. "Here," she said, her voice thick. "I am not a ghost. I am the woman who keeps the fire. I am the woman who patches up warriors. I am the woman who was worth saving." He was silent. He reached out with his good hand, his left hand, and slowly, gently, he cupped her cheek. His thumb was rough, calloused, and impossibly warm against her cold skin. It was the same touch he had given her in the canyon, but this time it was not followed by fear. It was filled with a quiet, profound reverence. "You are more than enough." "Lena," he whispered. His voice was rough with an emotion she had never heard from him. "You are everything." He leaned in. It was not the desperate, passionate kiss of a dime novel. It was slow, hesitant, almost awkward. It was a first kiss. It was the touch of his lips, chapped and dry from the desert, against hers. It was a question and an answer. It was a promise, sealed in the cold night air. It was a quiet, solid, and absolutely real. They stayed like that for a long moment. The silence of the canyon wrapped around them. When they parted, she was trembling, but not from the cold. "So," she whispered, her voice a little breathless, "what do we do now?" He did not let go of her hand. He looked up at the stars, then back toward the faint, distant glow of Dusty Creek. "Now," he said, his voice firm, "I must be the bridge. I must be the one who speaks to them. I cannot be silent any longer." He squeezed her hand. "And you?" Lena smiled. A real smile. A smile that reached her eyes and transformed her plain face into something beautiful. "I will be the anchor," she said. "I will be the cook, and I will be the one who remembers. I will write our story." 6 months passed. The high desert winter, sharp and unforgiving, had melted into a windy, unpredictable spring. The railroad was a finished thing, a set of twin iron scars stretching west until they vanished into the shimmer of the horizon. The constant, percussive sound of hammers driving spikes was gone. It was replaced by the low, lonely whistle of the 4 o'clock train, a sound that now marked the passage of days in Dusty Creek. The town itself had settled. Judge Whitlock was a name spoken only in hushed, angry tones, a cautionary tale about greed and lies. He was in a territorial prison in Santa Fe, awaiting a trial that everyone knew was a formality. His power was broken, his reputation ruined beyond repair. Marshall Boone was gone, disgraced, having left town on the same train that carried Whitlock away in chains, and Thomas Reed. He had simply vanished. He had left his new silver star on the marshal's desk, walked out of his new fiancée's life, and ridden east, swallowed by the plains he had come from. At the very edge of Dusty Creek, where the last packed dirt of the main street gave way to the narrow, rocky trail that led into the canyons. A new building stood. It was not a grand structure. It was made of thick adobe bricks that Lena and Hawk's aunt had mixed with their own hands and feet. The roof beams scavenged from railroad ties. It was solid and low to the ground, built to withstand the wind. A single unpainted wooden sign hung over the door, swaying gently in the breeze. The letters had not been painted, but burned deep into the wood with a hot iron. Hawk, his right arm now healed to a ropey, scarred stiffness, had carved it himself. It read, simply Lena's hearth. Inside, it was one large room. It was warm, and it smelled, as Lena's kitchen always had, of wood smoke, strong black coffee, and a rich, simmering stew that never seemed to run out. 2 long, rough trestle tables filled the space, and they were always full. This was the border. It was the only place in the territory where a traveler might see a cavalry sergeant, new to the territory and unaware of the history, sitting one bench over from Taza. Taza's side was healed, leaving a thick, puckered scar he no longer bothered to hide. He drank his coffee black, like Hawk. At the other table, 2 Mexican muleteers, their wide sombreros resting on their knees, spoke in low, rapid Spanish while they ate, sharing the bench with a pair of soot-grimed railroad workers who ate in a fast, hungry silence. Ravenhawk was there. He sat at his usual table, the one in the corner, his back to the wall, facing the door. He was still armed. His long knife was sheathed at his hip, and his old Colts were tied down. He was, and always would be, a warrior, but the air around him had changed. When he rode his black horse through Dusty Creek, the townsfolk no longer scattered. They no longer whispered of savages and scalps. The children, who had once been hurried inside, now stopped their games to watch him pass, their faces filled with a wide-eyed, nervous curiosity. 1 or 2 of the braver ones even waved, their small hands flapping. Hawk would sometimes, very rarely, incline his head in return. The new marshal, a quiet, practical man from Denver, would nod to him in greeting. "Hawk," he would say. A simple acknowledgement. Hawk would nod back. The whispers at Twig's saloon had changed. "He is a hard man." The talk went, "A hard man for a hard country. But he keeps the trail safe. Ever since that business with Whitlock. Well, the trail has been safe." He was no longer the most feared man in town. He was the silent protector. And Lena, she was the heart. She moved between the great, blackened fireplace, where the stew pot hung, and the 2 long tables. Her face was still plain, still freckled, still bony. She would never be the soft, pretty Rose that Thomas Reed had wanted, but the brittle weariness in her eyes was gone. It had been replaced by a deep, grounded confidence, a strength that radiated from her like the heat from her stove. She was no longer the rejected woman. She was the woman who had, with only her words, torn down the most powerful man in the valley. She was the woman who had walked into the wilderness and saved the life of the man they all feared. She was, as Twig, who ate every midday meal at her table, told any new visitor, the woman who runs the only honest kitchen in New Mexico. People came for the stew, but they stayed for the stories. They stayed to talk to her, to sit in the warmth of her hearth, to be near the woman who had looked a lynch mob in the eye and had not backed down. She was the keeper of the town's memory and its conscience. The harmony was real, but it was fragile. One afternoon, a drifter, a cowboy passing through on his way south, swaggered in. He was loud and drunk and full of the easy arrogance of his kind. He ordered coffee, then saw Taza sitting with Noche at the far table. The cowboy's face twisted into a sneer. "Well, I will be damned," he said, his voice loud enough to fill the room. "The sign is on the door, but they lettin' red men eat at the table now. What kind of civilized—" He stopped. Twig, who was at the next table, stood up slowly. He did not look angry. He looked tired. "Son," Twig said, his voice quiet but carrying. "We do not talk that way in here. We are past that kind of talk in this town. That is Whitlock talk, and we buried that talk with him." The cowboy looked at Twig's hard face. He looked at the railroad workers, who had stopped eating and were watching him. He looked at Hawk, in the corner, whose dark, cold eyes were fixed on him. The cowboy's bravado evaporated. I was just asking," he mumbled, sinking onto the nearest bench and staring at his cup. A small boy, perhaps 7 years old, ran out of the back room, a small wooden carving of a horse clutched in his hand. He had the high cheekbones and dark, bright eyes of the Apache. He was Elias, an orphan from one of the outlying bands, a boy whose parents had been lost to a fever during the hard winter. Hawk's aunt had found him, half-starved, and had brought him to the camp. Now, he was theirs. He ran straight to Lena, who was sliding a pan of cornbread from the oven, and tugged on her apron. Lena, look! Noche made the horse, it has a tail." Lena knelt, wiping her floury hands on her apron, her plain face breaking into a smile of such pure, uncomplicated warmth that it transformed her. "It is beautiful. Elias, now take this piece of bread to Taza, and do not run." Hawk watched from his corner, and the hard line of his mouth softened. Later that evening, after the last customer had gone, Lena saw Hawk sitting on the porch with the boy. Hawk, his own right shoulder still stiff from Whitlock's bullet, was patiently, silently, showing Elias how to fletch an arrow, his large, scarred hand guiding the boy's small, clumsy one. They did not need a piece of paper from a judge, or the blessing of a church. They were a family. That night, after the tables were wiped clean, Lena stood in the kitchen. She was, as she had been for so many years of her life, kneading dough, her hands, covered in flour, pushed and folded, in the same ancient, steady rhythm. The familiar motion brought the memory back to her, sharp and clear. She remembered that night, alone in the cold kitchen of the boarding house, her heart raw from the laughter of the saloon, her hands bleeding from kneading. She remembered the words Old Maid, hysterical, plain as a fence post. She remembered the crushing, suffocating weight of being unseen, unheard, and unwanted. She looked down at her hands, still red, still chapped, still strong. They were not the hands of a lady. They were the hands of a survivor. They were the hands that had fed a camp, and pulled a stone from a man's side, and held a dying man to the world. She looked through the open door, at the empty, dark tables where just hours before, white men and Apache had eaten her bread, together, from the same hearth. The door from the outside opened, and Hawk stepped in, bringing the cold desert air with him. He walked up behind her, not speaking, and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his solid, warm chest. "They are asleep," he said, his voice a low rumble, speaking of Elias and his aunt, who now lived in the cabin with them. Lena leaned her head back against his good shoulder, her hands stilled in the dough. "It was a good day," she whispered. They stood in silence for a long time, listening to the high, lonely sound of the wind. "They will still tell stories," Hawk said, his voice quiet, his gaze distant, looking out the small window at the dark canyons. "In the east, in the towns, the men who write the books, they will tell the wrong story, about the savage, about the war, about the judge who died a martyr." Lena stopped, her breath held. She turned slowly in his arms, her hands, white with flour, coming up to rest on his chest. She smiled. It was not the thin, brittle smile of the boarding house. It was the sure, quiet smile of a woman who knew, finally, exactly who she was. "Then we will tell a different one," she said. She looked up at him, her plain, freckled, beautiful face illuminated by the moonlight. "We will tell it here, in the stew, in the bread, in the way we live." Her voice was soft, but as strong and sure as the bedrock beneath their feet. "Those who really want to know the truth, they will come here. They will come to our hearth, and we will feed them." He looked down at her, the woman who was not pretty, the woman who had saved his life and his soul. He bent his head, and his lips met hers in a kiss that was no longer hesitant, but as sure and as solid as the ground they stood on. It was a kiss that tasted of flower, and smoke, and home. Outside, the camera of the mind pulls back. It moves away from the man and the woman in the small, warm kitchen. It floats past the empty tables, out the front door, rising high into the cold, clear, desert night. It sees the small, sturdy building, Lena's hearth, a single point of bright, warm light on the vast, dark boundary. It is a tiny island of peace, sitting on the line between the sleeping Shametown and the great, silent, listening canyons. The smoke rising from the chimney is a thin, steady ribbon, a signal, drifting up into the river of stars. No longer a sign of war, but a column of grace. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are tuning in from. Please share your thoughts and where you are from in the comments below, so we can all connect. And if you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Tales, liking this video, and hitting that hype button to help this story reach more listeners.